All right, shalom, shalom, family. I'm going to start a little early today. So we're going to say the Lord's Prayer first. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from evil. In your name we pray. Amen, amen. Shalom, shalom, family. Shalom, shalom. So I'm going to just get right to this little message here and start talking about this thing. Let me just go up a little bit, like my little spot here. Now, I want to talk about this little message because right now I'm trying to gather brothers and sisters that may have put themselves in a weird place and might get confused by some things. I want to talk about first I want to talk about some linguistic information. You probably heard about the name Jesus, right? I'm going to show you an example here in this little video, 2343. I'm going to go to something. This is what I see a lot of people do, and it's a linguistic problem, but let me show you something.
Jesus, Jesus, in Greek could mean Jesus, literally. Jesus means Jesus. It's the Greek for Jesus. Jesus. Huh?
Okay, so now listen very carefully. When we are transferring any type of if you're ever translating any language, it's important to understand the origin of the letters that's used in the language. For example, we don't look at something that's spelled today in English and think that that's how it was pronounced in Greek. For example, we're going to go to a note now, and we're going to talk about a very important secret in the name of Joshua, and how do we get the name what you see today, Jesus. The name Jesus is actually going to be very important to note something. I'm going to show something real fast. Let's first start like this and understand this. So the name Jesus, right, is actually basically, to make it short, I'm going to summarize it here and I'm going to show you a video. Just to make it short, it came from the name Joshua, right? Now, a lot of times you'll see it as Yehoshua, right? In the sense of Yehoshua, right? You can see that like, or Yahoshua, right? Joshua. Now, in Hebrew, it's spelled different, right? In English, there's a lot of different ways to spell it in English. Some people put Yeshua, some people put Yahshua, right? Things like that. But in Hebrew, it's spelled different, right? Remember, Joshua, is important to know that Joshua's original name was Hosea, right? Or Hosea, right? But Moses changed his name to Joshua, right? Yehoshua, right? And in Numbers 13 and 16, right? We get a later time that we see that name shortened. We see it in the biblical narrative. For example, we see it in Ezra. We also can see it in Nehemiah 8 and 17, where we'll see that name Joshua will shrink to the name Yeshua. Now, throughout the Greek translation, what's important, we're going to talk about the translation. How did the translation get to Yeshua, to Yehosus, we're going to go into it. We're going to go into it piece by piece. Let's go into it piece by piece now. So remember that Joshua originally had longer letters. These letters also have different meanings in pictographic Hebrew, right? Going right to left. I'm just going to skip down and go right to the understanding of Messiah, right? When we look at the name Messiah, right? When I say the name Yeshua or Jesus, it's really a branch from the name Yeshua. That's very important. We're going to also go to, because what's important is, not a lot of people know this, but the Matthew Aramaic text was found. They actually found the first century, a very old book of Matthew we're going to talk about in the Aramaic that actually has the same name. Now, let me go down a little bit before we even get there. Yeshua, this name right here, Yeshua is actually a shortened name of the name Joshua, right? It actually will be, in a sense, written in English like Yeshua, right? Or Jeshua. He will save. That's very important. It's actually a broken down name, right? I'm going to show you it in the scripture right here. You can see right here, there's a little verse, Nehemiah 10 and 9. You can see the name. So this is going to be the name Yeshua, right? That's very important. Yeshua is actually a name that's already used. Now, a lot of Jews had this name. Now let's have a conversation about this name real fast. have a conversation about it. So let me go over here. So there was found. What's important is to know that they actually found the early writings of the book of Matthew. Now there's a couple copies of it. There's a couple different copies of the book of Matthew, but they did find the book of Matthew. For example, it's even spoken of according to I'm gonna probably pronounce this all weird. Papias of Hierapolis, right? From basically 70 AD to 130 AD. He writes. Now, what's important is this individual very early on writes the Gospel of Matthew was written in the Hebrew language, and some Christians translated it into Greek, right? It's very important, right? What is he talking about? What is this talking about? What is this person, right? What's going on here? A little bit of that person. So right here, just to get a little idea, we're going to have an individual who basically is going to be over the churches. Now, I already said this before. When you see these little images, like these images, these are later images. For example, this image, you can note that's from the Number Chronicle, right? This is later on. This is the 1400s. Don't mind these images. When you see these images, we know who is Israel. We know who are the people. That's very important. We can get into those things. But when it comes to imagery, all the work, you got to know what time frame are these things. These early saints had nothing to do with the later Germanics that took over the Catholic, like the Holy Roman Catholic, the quote unquote Holy Roman Catholic Empire. When they took over the churches, that was later on. Early on, you're seeing the earliest sources for these things. This is very important when we talk about these things. But we're going to be talking about this individual that others also talk about, which we can talk about the sources as well. We can go into the sources and talk about these different individuals. I said it's Imabis. This person, or probably mispronounce that real fast, but this person and others like Polycarp, right? This is going to be early saints, right? They're all basically talking. They're all basically there, right? Reacting. And Polycarp is a disciple of John, right? We're talking, well, we're talking early disciples of John. Actually, I may have spoke real fast. Let me read something to you right here. So this individual, let me just make sure I show you real fast. So this individual here, who you're seeing here, I'm just gonna read something on this little part, right? He referred to the Papias, the thing, right? The Papias only in his third work, right? He talks about that was already there. This Papias. The Papias is also found, is what they're talking about. But he basically talks about that the Papias, right, knows several New Testament books, right? Whose whose dates are themselves controversial, right? Very controversial, right? Just because it's those dates all the way back, right? It's just talking about basically by the first and second century, others were talking about these writings, and also was verified in the writings themselves, right? It's very important. So it also talks about that it was talked about by other first century writers, right? That's going to be very important. Very little is known of the Papias apart from what can be inferred from his own writings, right? He is described as an ancient man who was a hearer of John, right? It's very important. We're going to talk about that, his connection with John, and a companion of Polycarp by Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus, right? Very important. Polycarp, right? Right after John, Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp, being a disciple of John. That's very important. Let's get a little idea of it.
Overseer in Hierapolis in Asia Minor around AD 120. He was a friend of Polycarp, and he heard the Apostle John preach. He was close to others who had Papias was an overseer in Hierapolis in Asia Minor around AD 120. He was a friend of Polycarp, and he heard the Apostle John preach. He was close to others who had seen Jesus. Therefore, he was very highly respected in the church. For example, Papias explained where and how John Mark wrote his gospel. He was martyred around AD 163. Sadly, all of his works have been lost. What we have has been preserved in quotations from other pre-Nicene writers such as Irenaeus and Eusebius. Today we have 10 fragments of his writings. About Papias, pre-Nicene Christians wrote, "These things are borne witness to in writing by Papias, the hearer of John, and a companion of Polycarp." Papias, affirms he received the sayings of the apostles from those who accompanied them.
All right, so we're getting early writings and we're getting connections of these writings. So this individual said that the Gospel of Matthew was already there. Now, the copy that we actually have is a very, very early copy, right? It's going to have a lot of different messages. We also had used it a long time ago to clarify some understandings in some of Matthew's genealogies. It really makes a big importance to basically what he wrote there and everything, to give the understanding of what kind of genealogies actually have, right? Just talk about one. He's basically talk about something. Remember that individual we was talking about earlier and everything when he was talking about what was going on in some of the writings. This is just talk about basically some clarifications that was noticed in the original Hebrew of the book of Matthew, right? It's just a visual copy of it, whatnot. So by the first century, it's important that we already got John, right? These are individuals that basically are disciples of John, right? Or disciples or people that know John, talking about the book of Matthew. That's very important, right? We're getting an idea of some of those things. But what's important in this book, it actually says Messiah's name. That's what's really interesting about this, because in this very book, it actually says Messiah's name. And let's look at that real fast. That in this book, it actually says Messiah's name. In fact, right here, you can see a little bit of the early writings. Let me just click this and show you something. All right. Just talk about some of the early writings and the early sources, right? Getting a little idea of what was there, right? I'm just gonna read you now. I just want to read you something because we're more focused on the linguistics than anything. What's important is basically what you're gonna see here. I'm just gonna read a little bit here, right? It's just gonna be talk about a little bit of the name, right? The naming of Jesus in Hebrew, Matthew, right? Just talk about in the book of Matthew, we'll see his name. Where is his name on this writing? Right? Where exactly is his name? Is right there. That's his name. How do we know that's his name? Because if you know the Hebrew, you know what you're seeing there. You're seeing Yeshua, right? Yeshua. Now you see that little initial there, then you see this, then this long one, and then you see this one right here. Looks a little slanted. You can see it right there. But that's what you're seeing right here, right? You're seeing the name Yeshua. It's very important. The name Yeshua. You can see this, and then you see that, and you see the longer one, then you see that thing slanted, right? Let's go back down. You can see it right there. The little one, a little W, the little sign like that, and the little thing slanted, right? Now, that's what's very important, right? It looks like a W, just to get a little idea on that little shape there. Yeshua, right? And remember, it's actually talking about the name of Messiah when it's talking about that. His name is Yeshua. But we got to understand, how did we get the translation, the later translation of that name and everything? We're going to talk about that and different things like that. So it's important to understand the name, original name that we saw there was Yeshua, right? In fact, this reading that he has here, this is what this reads. It says, "And she shall give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Yeshua, for he shall save my people from their iniquities." What does Yeshua mean? Right? The name Yeshua, right, was a famous name, and we're going to look at it. We can also know other Jews had this name. This is not a name that someone just get. It was not named after Zeus, because other people had this name, and it's a previous name that was there before. It's a name that actually has a meaning, right? The meaning to it is he will save, right? Very important. It's a little different than Joshua, right? It's a little different than Joshua. Sometimes you'll see different words in different places. Like, for example, right? I'm going to click this real fast. So Yeshua is different than Joshua, right? This one is actually Yah, or the Lord, or Yah, right? The first one will be Yah, Yehoshua, or Yahoshua, basically meaning Yah is my salvation, right? Yeshua is actually just putting a mark here saying that he is my salvation, right? The individual himself is the salvation, right? It's just shortened after time. That's very important. So this means Joshua. But you will notice that in the understanding, you will see that later it will change to Yeshua, right? That's very important. This is Yahoshua, right? You see that name right there? That's the name of God, Yah. And then the last part is salvation, Yeshua, the save. So you see how it's saying Yah saves. That's what it's saying there. Right here, you see Yah is not there, but you can see this is going to say he saves, right? This is not just talking about that, this saying that this individual has Yah in him, right? It's very important. This one is saying Yah saves. This one's saying he saves. They are essentially the same name. It's kind of like if you look at the name John, his name is actually, if you look at John in his original form, John is actually a Romanized name of the name, or a Greek-nized name of the name Johann, or in the sense of the longer Jonathan or Johannathan, right? Very important. Very, very important. We can get that in different places. Now let's look at what it even says right here when it talks about the translation. So you can see it also talks about a Bethlehemite, right? You can see it in the translation. You see that word right there? We're going to get an understanding on this word right here. This is actually how you put that word, how we translate Yeshua or Joshua to Greek, because this Greek right here is the name what translate later as Jesus, right? We're going to look at that as it translates later on in time. So it's very, very important as we look at these things. Let's keep on going. So this is a very early writing. Let's go over here. Let's go down. So there's the name Joshua, Yah, Shua. That's very important, right? Yah is our salvation, right? But Yeshua is saying this is our salvation. He is our salvation, right? Very important. Yeshua, right? Very important. Very, very important to get a little understanding on that. So we're not deceived by any type of misunderstanding. Now let's go a little more into it, a little more understanding into this name, right? Because his name is very important. It's a very important name, right? But we do see other people with the name. It's more about the meaning than anything else. Let's go down and get a little more deeper into it. Okay, so, and people that actually know Greek know Jesus doesn't even sound like Hail Zeus. That's very important. Let's look at what people understand. Multiple different examples. Let's get an idea of this.
In Greek, Zeus, completely different. This is a different letter than this. And there's a lot of other differences too, but as I said, I'll address it as I go. The names Jesus and Zeus might sound somewhat similar in English, but even in English, you can see the difference, Z compared to S. And in Greek, Omicron Upsilon Sigma, or Us, compared to Epsilon Upsilon Sigma, or Fs. So that is talking about the end of the word here. See, EUS, which transliterates from Greek into English, the end of the word would be EUS, as shown here and here, compared to OUS, the transliteration from the Greek word into English characters. The word ends in OUS, the last three letters of the word, I should say. Completely different. OUS, not the same as EUS.
Okay, example number one. This is just an example. Now, we will give anyone a slide when it comes to this if they don't know this that well, because they don't really know the Greek. But we're going to get to the understanding that this is even connected to the Latin, that anyone who knows Latin or Spanish should be aware that the I, because this is actually looking at the last part, right? This EUS. In English, you see that in English. You don't see that or sound like that in Greek. This right here, the EUS right here, both of these are two different sounding things. These are two different sounding things. In fact, Yeshua, when translated over, this word right here that I'm going to post at the end right here, this word right here, you see this letter at the end, this was actually added on. Why? Because we're gonna talk about it in Greek names. We're gonna talk about it in Greek names as we move forward. We're gonna talk about Greek names and why Greek names have that S at the end. We're going to talk about that. Let's look at another example of translation from another person.
Odd debate. Some people who actually embrace Jesus as Messiah believe that Jesus should never be spoken or used by anyone who embraces the carpenter from Nazareth as God in the flesh, the Savior of the world. To label him Jesus is to commit blasphemy, because that name belongs to a pagan god. Now, is that idea coherent? Should Christians not use the name Jesus when referring to their Savior? Well, let's find out. Now, it doesn't take a linguist to suspect that there's something amiss with the idea that Jesus comes from Zeus. Anyone who knows more than one language or who has studied another language long enough, anyway, to pick up some basic words will understand that just because words in two languages sound the same does not mean that they have the same meaning or that one derives from the other. For example, the word in English, gift, has a sound equivalent in Norwegian that means poison. In Dutch, rooster refers to a schedule. The word fart sounds the same in English and Swedish, but means speed in Swedish. Now, examples of this could run into the thousands. While illustrating the premise of this idea is deeply flawed is pretty easy, we need to unpack the controversy a little bit more. Let's start with some textual evidence. As the New Testament makes abundantly clear, Jesus was Jewish. Jews in the 1st century AD spoke Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, the language of the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament. Now, Jesus' 1st century Hebrew Aramaic name was Yeshua, which is a shortened form of Yehoshua, Joshua in English Bibles. English analogies for this sort of thing would be Mike for Michael or Pat for Patrick. So where does Jesus come from as opposed to Yeshua? Well, the answer to that is the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, again, what we think of as the Old Testament. The Jewish translators of the Septuagint rendered the name Yeshua or Yehoshua as Jesus in Greek. Again, that's where we get Jesus from. Now listen to that Greek name again, Jesus. Does it begin with a long E sound, like E as in T-H-E-Y, they, Jesus? Or does it begin with a Y sound? Now Jesus' Aramaic or Hebrew name began with a Y consonant, Yeshua. But Greek does not have a letter that makes the consonant Y sound with which we're familiar. So what to do? What would they do with the Aramaic Hebrew Y in Yeshua? The closest equivalent in Greek was the letter iota, iota. It looks like a capital or a small I. Now, if you say that letter name fast a few times, you'll notice that it starts to sound like iota, 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 iota. So the Greek I can sound like a Y, depending on your pronunciation. Now, like English, Y can have a consonant sound, ya, and they even share some letters. So what to do?
So there's just a little backstory, a little understand to it, right? Getting a little understand to these things, right? Play one more.
The name of the Son of God in Greek is Jesus. An accusation made is that this name is a compound word that means Hail Zeus. The sad reality is that perhaps due to the Zeus sound, people believe such a claim. There is no similarity in appearance with the Greek words translated as Hail Zeus or Jesus. Consider the Greek name Zeus, made up of 4 Greek letters. There's also the Greek name Jesus. There are 4 Greek letters that make the Zeus sound in Jesus. Notice that only 2 of the 4 letters match the letters in Zeus. The Greek word translated as hail in the Greek scriptures also has no match to anything in the name Jesus. This is not even a matter of transliteration, as both of these names are in Greek. An example of a true compound name is shown with the Hebrew name Melchizedek. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 2 reads, "The name Melchizedek means king of righteousness." Here is the word Melchizedek. Here is the word king. Here is the word righteousness. So when you put king followed by righteousness, you end up with Melchizedek. The question then becomes, Where did the word translated as Jesus come from if it is unconnected from the words Hail or Zeus? First of all, what was the name that Mary called her son? 2 of the times Jesus appears in the Greek scriptures, it refers to Joshua, son of Nun. One of these times it reads, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day." Joshua's name in Hebrew is pronounced Yehoshua. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. You may be wondering why people refer to the Savior as Yeshua instead of Yehoshua. Joshua's name in Hebrew was also pronounced as Yeshua. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this. The name Yeshua began being used after 517 BC. The Hebrew letters in both Yehoshua and Yeshua do not all have parallels in Greek. Only 2 out of 5 letters have parallels. Because of this, it is very difficult to transliterate the name into Greek. For the person who believes Jesus means Hail Zeus, I would like to know how they would transliterate the Savior's name into Greek. There are certain rules in transliterating names into Greek that I am ignorant of. I have included an explanation in the description for your consideration.
All right, so now let's get a little deeper into the understanding of this. So, are there other examples of other people called Jesus throughout the times? So, in Josephus writings himself, he has multiple different examples of different individuals who are named Jesus, like Jesus, son of this one. We're going to talk about this one individual here real fast, right? It's very important just to get an idea of what he writes about him. He basically writes a little bit in one of his writings, right, concerning James, when James was killed and everything. He talks about basically that James, right, he says that James was a brother of Jesus. Now, this Jesus who was called the Christ, right, whose name, they talk about this brother, right, the brother whose name was James, his brother was Jesus, who was called the Christ, right? He makes a difference between that Jesus and these Jesus. There's a different Jesus. Sometimes what's important is not a lot of times you see them with last names. Rather, they usually would be like for example, they'll say something like Jesus, son of Gamaliel or something like that, or you will have someone named after the place, right? Jesus of Nazareth, things like that. You got different people with this name, right? That's very important. You'll have different people with the same name because Joshua was a famous name, right? You get things like that, Joseph, Joshua, right? Matthew, things like that. Those are classic names even today. Those are famous names. He makes a difference between that Jesus, right? The Jesus right here, where he talks about, I'm going to read it. Not the best reader, though, best pronouncer. Fetus was basically now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges. So remember, the Sanhedrin is a group of the Jews. So he's gathering a group of the Jews and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. So he's saying this Jesus was called Christ, whose name was James. So he brought James in front of the Sanhedrin and some others for some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, why is he making James a breaker of the law? We're going to see something really interesting with a connection to James and his connection to Messiah. When did this happen? Well, I'm going to actually show you that James being accused was in 62 AD. That's very important. These are real events that are recorded by others. I'm going to show you that others also record these events. And it says, and whereby, obviously, he said, made him a breaker of the law, right? Formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law. He delivered them to be stoned. So James was stoned. We'll talk about that because they talk about James stoning, because apparently this James and the family of Messiah was actually a major family. This family of David was actually a very powerful and well-known family. And I'm going to show you that other people in that land end up writing about them. We'll talk about that. You can see right here, just talk about another person, right? Talk about King Agrippa took the high priesthood before him when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, son of Demanius, high priest. So this is a different Jesus. Now, this is very important, right? What Jesus is he talking about? He's talking about a different Jesus, right? This is a different Jesus, right? Jesus, son of Demanius, right? You see that name right there? That's the Isus. That's very important. What name is that? Yeshua. Yeshua, right? Yeshua ben Danami. Or I'm probably pronouncing that last part wrong, but you see what I'm saying here? This is going to be very important that different individuals with these names, right? Joshua is actually Yeshua. That's very important. Yahushua or Yahashua, right? Yahushua, right? Different ways you can pronounce that, but always understand, them having the Hebrew, they would have it more perfect than we. We can't look at things in our English language and think it always was translated over like that. But it's letting us know about this individual here, right? That's a real individual. It's very important. We'll go down a little bit, a little more on him. A little more on this is a different individual. There's other individuals with the name Yeshua, right? Joshua, right? A lot of times there'll be son of so and so, different sons of so and so and so and so, right? Different individuals, right? Very important. Let me show you something now. Let me go to here and I'm gonna show you something now. Throughout this week, since I'm off, I'm gonna go over some very interesting, deep things on this note. But first, let me show you something in a very interesting way. So let's talk about something that happened with James and basically a conclusion that comes down. So this is gonna be a book. Let me click this and show you which book this is. What book are we looking at? We're gonna be looking in the archive, and this is a book. It's called The Messiah, Jesus, and John the Baptist, according to Slavic Josephus and recently rediscovered capture of Jerusalem and other Jewish and Christian sources. Now, it's using more than just Jewish and Christian sources. It's going to be using things from Tacticus. We're going to be using a lot of different sources in this read. He's going to be using a lot of different things. This is from 1931 when they comprised this. It's going to be a comprise of a bunch of different historical records. It's very important. I'm going to go to it and talk about what's on it real fast. You guys, some very deep things that we're going to talk about real fast. All right, so it's going to talk about one of the individuals on chapter 3 of the 5th book of this one, Patmos. This is going to be very important. It's just going to talk about basically accusations by Josephus of John, I'm probably going to say that word wrong, Gishchala, and his zealots, right? Zealots, that's just going to be Jews. That's very important. Now, it's important to know that Josephus, there's a lot of external sources that talk about Josephus as a person. They also talk about Peter and Paul as a person, because during the time they were making big examples with certain groups. That's very important. So it's going to be, and this is going to be, what you're seeing here is going to be a quote. It's a very early quote and everything. We're talking about some of the earlier writers and things. It's not from Josephus' writing. This is not from the biblical narrative. This is going to be basically what they account for, right? There's a historical record of what they account for. Talk about the zealots, because during the siege, they did not shrink from using the sacred wine. So they were using some wine and oil in the temple, right? And the chapter ends with a various attack by, right, basically the pious author on that sinful generation. So he just basically complains about the generation and everything. This must have induced a Christian interpolar. I'm trying to pronounce that word are weird. But basically it caused the Christians to basically jump in, right, to introduce the two still greater crimes of the Jews, right? The crucifixion of Jesus and the murder of James. So this is still early on, and we're gonna talk about the time of this. This letter is gonna give us the time that the Christians are coming up and making their interjecting, right? They're giving basically a logical argument on what happened in that time, and they're basically saying what's going on. And here's going to be that writing of it. The reworker of Eusebius, utilized, I probably said it weird, utilized by the Chronicon, this right here. Then read in his, I'll keep saying this word, interpolation or interpolate. I don't know why I say that word weird. Copy, just this copy right here of this paper, right, of this thing, the following passage. So you can see there's going to be a copy basically from this and translate it. The reason why it's important because the summary. Just talking about this interpolation of the story of James, right? Is going to be basically letting us know immediately before the fall of the city. Now, this is very important. We're getting a document that's talking about what's going on in this city, that the people are they're angry with all these things, but it's going to give us a date, right, of the city. It explains the dating of his death by this person, right? Some people probably know how to pronounce these names a little better than me. Epus and of Esebus, right? Probably pronouncing those names wrong, but understand these names right here, just letting us know the individuals that's involved, right? While Josephus himself put the stoning of James correctly before the beginning of this individual Albinus term of office, AD 62. Now, it's very important. It's giving us pinpoint understandings and different individual names that were in that time, because all these are contested in different records, all aligned, saying that even Josephus wrote about this accurately. But we're looking at reports outside of Josephus. But he says, in comparison to those reports, Josephus is actually telling the truth, that in 62 AD, James was stoned. The dating of the fall of Jerusalem in the 3rd year of Vespasian. That's very important. Against, be it noted, the chronologically exact statement of Josephus himself, right? Just talks about these things. The 2nd year clearly shows that this actually puts the crucifixion of Jesus, which took place 40 years previously. And then what time was the crucifixion of Jesus? Before I go to this, have you ever heard of the 70 weeks prophecy? If you never heard of the 70 weeks prophecy, in the book of Daniel, it talks about this thing called the 70 weeks prophecy, right? I'm going to show you something. You just open it here, and I'm going to show you something with this 70 weeks prophecy real fast. So there's a couple different things on the 70 weeks prophecy. Let me actually put this over here. All right, so let me show you the next page. What he says is the time of Messiah's crucifixion. When exactly was Messiah's crucifixion? The year 31 AD, right? This is very important. This is very, very important. Very, very important. Why? Why is it important that it was 31 AD? Because the 70 weeks prophecy, right? If you know the 70 weeks prophecy in the book of Luke, he writes a lot of different pinpoints, right? When he talks about certain reigns, Tiberius, right, and Augustus, that comes to an exact time, right? It lets us know that Messiah, basically, long story short, was baptized in 27 AD, but in 31 AD was Messiah's crucifixion. That's very important. How do we know? There's multiple ways of finding out, multiple ways besides the fact of the writings in the book of Luke, right? The historical accounts in the book of Luke. We can also look in the earthquake reports. The earthquake reports as well lets us know when that earthquake had happened. Also, the time of Messiah's birth that's described in the Gospels, where it talks about Mary, right? She had her baby 6 months after John. And then it's important to note John's father. When did he have the sign to him, right, during his office, the time of his office? But what's important is, let me show you this one right here, just the original. The 70 weeks prophecy, it starts at the time of Ezra. It's a prophecy about the Messiah. It's in Daniel 9, 23 to 27. It talks about word for word. You can read it word for word. It talks about the Messiah, right? In fact, it reads like this in 25. Know therefore and understand that the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. So this is what makes the 70 weeks prophecy important. That the temple was built to the Messiah. The temple had to be built for the Messiah's coming. The Messiah had to come to the temple before it was destroyed. How do we know? It continues, says, into the Messiah the Prince shall be 70 weeks. If you know about the biblical narrative, this is actually saying weeks. Those weeks are actually 7 years. It's saying 70 times 7, right? 70 years times 7. And starting at the point of Ezra, when the time that Ezra came during the time of Artaxerxes, when he called the people to rebuild Jerusalem, the time of that 70 weeks goes all the way to 31 AD. Exactly 31 AD was the time of Messiah's crucifixion. So this individual says, based upon these historical documents, it also comes to the fact, even though we know that James was also stoned in 62 AD, based upon all the rulers too as well at that time, going back just a little bit of the time, back 40 years, we can see that Messiah himself, right? Going back over here, to this, make sure right here, right? In 31 AD, just going back a little bit, zoom in, right? You can see what it's saying right here, where it's talking about the dating of the fall of Jerusalem in the 3rd year of Vespasian, right? Letting us know what happened, right? Clearly shows that basically the crucifixion took 40 years previously. So remember, what's important is Jerusalem fell, right? 70 AD, right? And then there was more that happened after that 73, right? In 73, you have the fall of Masada and things like that. Is letting us know in the 3rd year of Vespasian, going back 40 years, in 31 AD, that's when Messiah was crucified, right? That's very important. So it's letting us know these historical accounts are real. Now, those are some really interesting things. But I want to show you a little more, something else really interesting. Watch what it says here. In this book, the book that I'm showing you is basically a book trying to prove if Messiah exists using multiple external sources. Let me read you something here of the conclusion. The historicity of Jesus as a heretic teacher of the Jewish law is established beyond doubt by the testimony of his disciples, Jacob of, have you ever heard of this person, right? His disciple, Jacob of Kfar Sekajah. That's very important. A man unknown to Christian sources. Very important. But this person is actually, you got to look into these people and you'll see that these people actually write about Christ. It's very important. We'll talk about these things in a little more detail, but we're getting a little understanding on the timing of these things, right? A man unknown to Christian sources, right? Transmitted through the rabbis. This is very important. Eliezer, right? Rabbi Eliezer you see this person right here and this person, right? You see these two people. We're gonna look at these two people. I know you say that Akaba. This person, Hikanos, probably pronounced that weird, but this was early 2nd century, right? Going on from the 2nd to the 1st century, right? Very early on. Both on the latter witnesses, right? Latter witnesses being decidedly hostile to Christianity. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that these early 1st century, these are Jews, do you think that these Jews were writing about Christianity, complaining about them? The execution of one Christus by the Roman emperor, right? Pilate under Tiberius. What do we see here? Is letting us know that these are complaining about a man who was basically called Christus by the Roman governor Pilate under Tiberius as a criminal and founder of a band of conspirators hostile to the whole human race, they say. What does he mean hostile to the whole human race? Because he's saying be baptized or you're going to be perished, right? Be baptized, read Mark 16:16, right? Is established thanks to the testimony of Tacitus. So this is saying that Tacitus and let's look at Eliezer. Let's look at what Eliezer is he talking. What is this Eliezer that's complaining about Christianity existing in that time? Who is this Eliezer that we're talking about? Josephus talks about him. Some people don't know that, but he does. Josephus talks about him. Let me show you something about Eliezer. Let's talk a little bit about him. So he writes some stuff, right? He's going to be writing some things. Let me just jump down and show you. What is he? A high priest, right? It's very important. He was a Kohen. Josephus and many others, like Eliezer, they were Levites. They were Kohens. But these Levites were warriors. Just like Levi of old. If you look at Levi, the Levi of old with Simon, they were warriors as well, right? Levi and Simon, right? They had slayed a whole group of people because they have messed with their sister. Remember that? But let's get down into where they talk about Christ. Do you know that they talk about Christ here, right? We're talking about the Sanhedrin. Remember, Sanhedrin is the group of the judges, right? Little idea of the Sanhedrin. They're a group of the judges, right? Someone would basically stand in the middle and you got all these judges around basically judging one individual, right? Group of the Sanhedrin. But let's see what they write about. Watch what it says right here. In a rabbinic accounts, right, of these ones in the Babylonian Talmud and all these things of these Jews and whatnot, and it's going to be first, early, second century Jews and whatnot, and this individual, right, all relate that Eleazar was arrested for heresy after agreeing with a religious teaching proposed by a man named Jacob, who was a follower of Yeshua, often seen as Jesus. So you see what he's saying? So this Yeshua, right? We're talking about the very Yeshua, and they're talking about Yeshua, right? They're writing that this Yeshua, Eleazar, ended up agreeing with one of the writers named Jacob, right? That's very important. How do we know that's true? It's also contested by obviously the account of it, right? Very important. It says scholars connect this arrest and subsequent trial with the persecutions of Christians by Roman authorities, as demonstrated in the letters between Emperor Trajan and, you see right there, I forget how you say the first name. Basically, what's that? Lenny the Younger, something like that. I probably said it weird, but a lot of people know about this individual. A lot of people know about this individual. These are all first century sources that are all connected, letting us know that this individual Messiah, right? He himself was spreading Christianity. In fact, it goes on and talks a little more. That is the Roman. It just talks a little more about that is the Roman, right? The Romans apparently arrested Eleazar under charge of being a Christian. So he's saying Eleazar, this same Eleazar that was complaining, right? It's very important. The same Eleazar that we seen recorded complaining about Christ, right? About this individual, right? Christos, right? Or Christos or Christus, right? He was complaining about him, these two individuals. We're going to look at this individual too. They were complaining about him, but later on, they started to believe some of his writings. They were believing some of the writings. Because not a lot of people know that the writings, the things that of Christians, when it was coming, it was originally for the Jews. The message was originally for the people to believe, right? But what happened, right? What happened? It's very important to note these things, right? Very important. It goes on, it talks about some other things and whatnot, right? Gets to some other things. Just going to talk about something real fast on this one, right? Now, let me go back over here. So you see his name right here? I'm going to actually type it down here. Oh, it's right here, just to make sure. Now, it looks weird, this one right here, but that's going to be the other individual. It says this individual basically said applied to Eleazar the terms which Elijah had applied to Elijah and everything. Just talk about some things. This individual had some connections with this individual. So these are two different individuals, but they also speak. They have writings where they contest that they were dealing with Christians and they were dealing with an individual who they called Christos, or they called him Yeshua, right? Often seen as Jesus. Very important. That these were historical fellows that they were dealing with at the temple, right? These are going to be Judeans that they themselves was dealing with the Messiah early on. That's very, very important. That's very, very important. There's a little more into it, right? Go into the writings and everything, whatnot. Let's go a little more into these things. So it just talks about other places, other things that are talked about with this Messiah and everything. And just click it and scroll down, right? Who else does it talk about, right? It's just talking about the fact of the Christians and everything and all those things. It talks a little more on it, but I'm going to go over. Let's talk about real fast. Who else was there? Who else was in that time and whatnot? Paul. How do we know Paul was there? Because we get some other writings where it talks about Paul. It says, just talks about basically some things. I'm going to go down a little bit. Just going to read a little bit what happened there. So he just talks about some things that had happened later on, with some of the revolts and everything, they talk about different Jews in those areas, like Babylonian Jews, right? They just talk about the Babylonian Jews rising up because of some things that were going on, because they were basically making the Jews pay a tax. Let me read you something here that it talks about. So again, this is going to be basically pulling up multiple historical sources, as you can see here. It's going to be multiple historical sources and multiple historians that are going to be putting these things together, right? Just talk about some things. I'm going to go down and talk about a little bit what's going on here, right here. To make the fulfillment of the oracle of a Jewish world ruler of David's line altogether impossible, Vespasian proceeded to have. Now look, Vespasian is actually trying to stop, because what's important that the Jews knew a Messiah was going to come. But Vespasian did something that's very important that a lot of people know of. Vespasian put a idol in the temple. A lot of people don't know about this, but let me show you something real fast, of something else. Vespasian proceeded to have a list made of all discoverable members of the ancient house, and probably to prescribe them. Now, what does he mean of the ancient house? He's basically asking, who's of the line of David? Who's all of the line of David? Tell me who's all of the line of David, because I know the line of David is going to become kings. He says that measure appears to have led to the arrest and trial under Domitian. He's basically saying the same paperwork that he had is the same paperwork that was used during the time. Remember John? John himself was actually one of the people that was persecuted by Domitian. We can talk about that in some of the historical writings and talk about how John was basically put in a basically boil. I'm just going to type it down. We can go to the historical documents of it, but I'm just going to type it down to show you what I'm saying is true. John was put in boiling water. I'm going to show you real fast just to get a quick idea. Let's just look, get a little idea. In fact, let me type it down a little better. John in boiling water. If you never heard of this event, this was actually a very important event. Let me actually copy a piece of that so that you can see it. Domitian. Let me actually put that there. Let me see. Make sure I spell his name right. Exactly as it. Yeah. Okay. I thought so. All right. So this individual, if you never heard this account, is a very, very important historical account. Why did John get to the land of Patmos? What was Patmos? What was the Isles of Patmos? The Isles of Patmos was a prison island. Who put him there? Domitian. Domitian had put John on Patmos. This is a real event. This is a highly accounted event. John even leaves that island. That's how the book of Revelation is given back to the saints. It's very important. This is in 97 AD. That's very important. The saints were going from the 1st and 2nd century. High contested documents. We can go to some writings of it, but let's continue on because I want to focus on Messiah, because actually this is all about the linguistics. Remember, all we're talking about right now is the linguistics of Messiah, but still pointing it to the time of the Jews, right? That the Jews were there. But look what Vespasian made a list, and Domitian used that list of the last surviving sections of the family of Jesus, claiming descent of David. You see what he's saying there? Domitian basically had a list of all the line of David, and that was the family of Jesus claiming descent of David, right? All these measures to which must be added the conversation of the old Jewish temple, right? Contribution, right, is very important. They were, and this is what this is what's recorded too. They were taking contributions, right, in basically, their type of money into a poll tax payable to the treasury of Jupiter, right? Capitolinius. Now, this is very important because they were basically trying to make them basically, pay their idol. Now, remember, they already had their own idolatry going on, but their idolatry is mythicism. But these individuals are talked about like historical figures because they are historical figures. It's very important. Let's continue on. Let's continue on to understand what's going on here when it's talk about these things. I'm just going to skip a little bit down. It just talks about basically the Jews getting really upset, like Jews and the Parthians and everything, because basically what happened when at last under Trajan, right? This is very important. Under Trajan, right? A siege had happened. If you never heard of it, it's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. That happens later on. It just talks about, basically, it talks about Jews, right? you can see right here a little bit understanding. It says Josephus undertook to describe it was led by a Messiah king, Andrew Laodicea. Basically, this person's trying to pretend like he was a Messiah, this person named Andrew of Laodicea. That is to say, a Jew who, like Paul, right, like Paul, belonged to the dispersia of the southern Asia Minor, right? And he just talked about this Jewish king, this one named Andrew, right, who was leading the individuals. Basically, he basically had massacred, right? You can see right here, background of merciless, basically just massacres of the Jews and Gentiles and whatnot. And just talks about basically he raised a rebellion and whatnot. But long story short, this is basically the leader at this time was a man of the village of Bar Kokhba, right? And this one right here. And it just talks about basic connections into the final part of it, where it just ends like this. It says, be noted, which according to Christian tradition was the home of the kinsfolk of Jesus. Just talks about that area, was a little area of it. And it also says he was recognized by the famous rabbi. Remember this one we was talking about, Kaaba. It just talks about this story right here is contested with other individuals. The stories that you're seeing here are all aligned. There's different stories that align it. For example, do you know that they actually had a picture of first and second in the first century? The first century saints continued on to the second century. Did you know they made an image of Paul and Peter? Did you know they made an image of Paul and Peter? Now, obviously, Christianity doesn't allow images, but I want to show you something real fast. Let me read you something from this book real fast. Let me actually go to something here and show you something here. Let me go to a page here. Let me just make sure I got the right one. And I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you what Peter and Paul looked like to the first Judeans. This is the earliest pictures of Jews in the first century. Let me go to 500. You're going to see the first pictures of Jews in the first century, right? So it's going to get a good early understanding of the first century Jews in the first century. Now, before I show you that, let me read you something here that they write here. Now, they had a lot of imagery of the saints very early on. Let me actually see if I can zoom in a little more. All right. Let me show you something. Watch what it talks about how Paul looked. And he saw Paul concerning a man small in stature, bald-headed, right? It talks about that in the biblical narrative that his hair, right? He cut his hair and everything. His hair was like low, right? Just talks about a little bit thing like, right? Prominent nose and things like that. Just basically means a nose that many people had, right? Full of grace. At times he looked like a man. Other times looked like an angel and whatnot. It says a brief counterpart of his occurrence in the so-called Passion of Paul, where we are told how Paul was arrested, right? Just talks about some things. It talks about, and remember, what happens when you get arrested? See a tall black man with a blah, 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 right? Things like that. Look what they say. He was easily recognizable, right? Having a crooked body and a black beard and a bald head. You see what he's saying there? Say he had a black beard and a bald head and things like that. Let me just show you what he looked like. Let me show you what they had an image in the second century of Paul. What I'm clicking now is now you're going to see in the first and second century what they believe what Paul looked like. Right here, you see this head that's a little bit loose, a little hair going here. This is actually Paul. And what you see on this side, let me read you what you see right here. Why do they use bronze? Bronze discs with second century portraits of Peter and Paul. This is a first, second century. We're talking early first, second century. So you know what it means by first, second century, right? Right here, like 0 to 100, that's your first century, right? 100 to 200, that's your second century. So he's saying within this time frame, the same individuals that was witnessing to the gospel, they had understanding on what Paul. Remember, in the first century, Paul and Peter were killed. So the first viewers of them who were able to describe them based upon how they looked, they already made their image early on. Now remember, like I said, Christians don't allow making images, but let's look at these images. This is what Jews look like. Look at those noses. Look at noses of those ones. And now this is very important because we've been studying genetics for a long time. We know what the people look like. There's no doubt when you get an idea on what these people look like, there's no doubt on what they had looked like in that time. Now, obviously, Paul right here is very old. You can tell he's older, right? Definitely older. You can see the bushy beard. Got a bushy beard. Peter over here with a bushy beard as well. Very important to get a good idea of what they would look like to the early saints. What's acceptable to the early saints? Look at the bridge of his nose, right? Look at that nose. Is that long nose? Look at that nose right there, right? More of a thicker nose right there. A very detailed face. Get a good idea of the face. These were the early Jews, right? These were the early Jews in this time, right? And they were being persecuted. They were the early Christians, right? The early Christians of that time. This is historical documents that you're seeing here. Historical documents of these individuals. Let's get back to where we was at. So we're just scratching the surface, as you see. But getting back down, because we're actually going to be rebuking Gnosticism today. But I wanted to show you that on the historicity of Christ. When you think of that name, the name Yeshua, the name Jesus, right, does not mean hell Zeus. That's from someone that's linguistically impaired. If someone says that they are linguistically impaired, they may have a lot of sources, but they don't have a lot of understanding of the sources. It's very important. Let me go down a little bit. All right. So that's very important, right? That statement is very important. The understanding is very important, right? But let's continue reading because we didn't go into the understanding yet. So just to get a little understanding on these individuals during the first century that they were there. There's others that write about those things. Now, what's important is the letter Y today, or I and J, right? If we trace its roots back, right, it goes all the way back to the letter Yud, right? Or Yod, right? The letter Yod basically is where the I and J came from. But let's talk about something really important. Do you know that in the KJV, when it was translated, they didn't put Jesus Christ, they put Jesus, or this name right here. Let me show you something. This is actually in the 1611 KJV, right? I can show you history from the 1st century to the 16th century by one book. That would be Martyr's Mirror, where it has all the saints from talk about their baptisms to their basically what they believed and everything. But you can see right here the original 1611, right? And if you look here, you can notice that it will talk about basically individuals. Remember, it doesn't even put any J's, right? J is actually a modern, that J with the hook, right? We see that letter right there. It was Isus. It wasn't saying Jesus. They would actually say more the Isus from the Greek Isu, which is actually coming from the Hebrew Yeshua. But remember that S is added on to make masculine names masculine. That's what we didn't talk about yet, to get into that a little bit. First, let me talk about that masculinity, why names sometimes get a thing like that. Those little things that you see, let me show you something real fast. There's a little understanding here. Why you see sometimes with Greek names, they have those add-ons of that. That's in every male name. They do that with every male's name, and they do different things for the female's names, right? They'll look like this at the end of a female's name. But a lot of times in the masculine names, you'll see those S's at the end, right? Things like that. There's a little understanding on that. Let me go over here and read on it. Male names usually end in these type of letters, what you see here. That's just basically letting us know that that's going to be your masculine. When you start seeing names with those letters at the end, masculine letters. This is just what it looked like in English. S, S, O, S, E, S, A, S, and things like that. But sometimes ancient forms are also used, right? They just talks about females having a at the end or an N at the end. So you'll see things like that, a little different, right? Isus, at first, you see this word right here. At first, it didn't have an S, right? It was Isu. But that would have made it feminine, right? They would have believed that would have made it feminine, so they had to change that last letter and put an S at the end. And that made it Isus, right? Isus. Now, the first letter you may have seen it become a J. Now, if you know the history behind that, there's a lot of history behind the letter J. But here's a quick understanding. If you know Spanish, or if anyone's Latin or anything like that, they already know that the letter J can sound like a letter Y. For example, right here, you can see right here in the word yes, yogurt, you can see J, close that. So J is the sound we find in words like young, yes, yogurt, stuff like that. It is similar to a short I, right? Things like that. You can see right here, yellow and things like that and whatnot. But let's get a little idea. You can see right here with Spanish, you can see it with J, right? Things like Johann and stuff like that, right? John or George, right? say George in Spanish, right? All right, you get things like that. You get a change. So you see that J,
Yellow.
right? You see this? Yellow,
Leo.
Leo. You can see what's going on there. Very important. Get a little understanding. A lot of people who know Spanish know these things very well, right? They're equating with these things to get an understanding, right? They know these things.
Job.
So that's very important. Just to get a little quick understanding that the J can sound different sometimes. So it's very important. The J can sound different. It can sound like an I, or it can sound like a I. It can sound like an I, or it can sound like a J. So it's very important. Just to get a little understanding on that, right? So linguistics, is important to study linguistics very carefully. So that's very, very important. Others will talk about it as well. I'll put this note in the description, just to get a little understanding on these things. So obviously understand linguistics. It came from this letter. The letter that it came from is the Yud or Yod. Very important. This is the letter, right? What's important is from the Hebrew, right? It got translated into Greek. The Greek has two letters, right? The Latin and the Greek, right? That's the I. That I later on became a J, right? We can talk about that and get into that. The J was a later thing that was added. We can talk about that. That's going a little more into linguistics, right? A little more into linguistics, but we're not going to it now. So just to get an understanding, if you hear someone say, "Hey, Zeus," they're linguistically impaired. They're linguistically impaired, and they probably have some hate against the Messiah that they themselves might need to work out. Let's look at another thing. So now let's get into what this video is about. We're about debunking. I just want to give myself a timestamp. So any questions so far? If you have any questions, let me know. Besides these ones that's putting little ads there. But if you have any questions at all, let me know, and we'll touch on those questions directly. As my call is to call brothers who are, or anyone that's on that page that may be getting tricked, or any page that may not know the biblical narrative as well as we can demonstrate. So very important to know the 70 weeks prophecy is very, very pinpoint. Get into the understanding of the Messiah. So starting at 15, I'm going to get here and look at this. I'm going to point something out here real fast. When you see individuals say one thing and say another, you got to note that. For example, this individual is very angry, raging, and let me just show you what he says here.
Main center of Hellenistic Judaism. What? The main place where they were starting their hijack.
So what's important is he marks that Jerusalem is so close to Antioch, right? And Antioch is right next to Turkey. But he himself tries to sell that Jerusalem is in America. If Jerusalem is in America and Antioch is right next to Turkey, how can we get Jews going into the area of this area when this area is right here? When this area is right here, how can we get the people influencing Christianity, or even influencing Jews over here, right? Let me actually show you something real fast. Let me actually open up a note. I'm going to show you something real fast. Do you know what converted Gentiles were called? And who converted the Gentiles? Do you know who really converted the Gentiles, and what converted Gentiles are actually historically called? What's the word? That's an actual word, right? A designated word that's used towards converted Gentiles to Judaism. It's called proselytes, right? Proselytes it's very important to note that proselytes were seen throughout all of history, right? We're going to talk about that real fast, right? What are proselytes? What is a proselyte, right? What is those things? Now, it's important to understand who converted who and why is it important, because the same people who were converted later converted who you see today as the Ashkenaz. We'll talk about that as a different thing, right? They talk about the Persian Jews, right? Were the ones that converted the Ashkenazim, right? That's very important. But who were the Persian Jews, right? What were they? What were these individuals? Let me show you something real fast, right? This land right here is very important, right? It's right next to the biblical narrative. It's always by the biblical narrative. The Hittites, right? Things like that. Where are the Hittites, right? In Turkey, things like that. We can still find multiple evidence for those things. But let's talk about the proselytes. So note, many Greek proselytes converted to Judaism in BC. So in BC time, it's very important to note this. In BC time, many Greeks converted to Judaism, right? It's very, very important. Many Greeks, they had converted to Judaism. They were called Greek Jews, right? They're also called Greek Jews. The term Greek Jew is obviously predominantly used for any Jew that lives or originate from modern region of Greece, right? Very important, right? We're going to talk about some things when it comes to those things, right? Very important. Go back. All right, so get a little more understanding, right? I'm going to read you something from there. I think it's important. The local native descendants of Greek or Greco-Syrian converts, right, to mainstream Judaism, known as proselytes, right? Greek, this is the Greek word for it, proselytes and everything right there. And Greek-speaking Jews born of mixed marriages, right? Greek-speaking Jews born of mixed marriages. It's talked about in the Bible too. Acts 13, 43. Now, when the congregation had broke up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, right? Very important. Who speaking to them persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. Proselytes is an actual word, right? Basically lets us know that is a non-Jew who has been circumcised and has adopted the Jewish religion. That's very important. A proselyte is something that many people would know about when you're studying on these things. You got to be careful not to compare a real bloodline Jew to proselytes or things like that because it can cause confusion. The proselytes did different things. Let's look at an example right here. It says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Where's Corinth? Athens. Obviously, these are going to be places over here, right? He complains that some of these people had converted to Christianity. If these people converted to Judaism, how hard is it for them to convert to Christianity? Very important. Not that hard. They already converted to Judaism. Why? Because they're trying to be saved. Who else can they be saved in besides the Most High Yah? Very important. But we got to understand that the way that was established of old by the fathers when they came out of the land of Egypt, that way they broke. How many times did they break it? Not just twice, but many times. But the twice that they did was heavier than the many times they did before. That's very important. But he made a way. How did he make a way? We'll go into that when we go into the depth of the gospel and talk about what did Yah actually do for Israel to save them. Because that's very important to understand that he made a way for them to be saved. Not because of their self, but because someone else. That's very important. But let's continue on. Understand, right? Found certain Jew, right? Now, his example, right? He found a certain Jew, right? In the book of Acts 18:2. Found a certain Jew named Aquila, right? Born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, right? Very important because what happened? Claudius, very important historical document. We can confirm Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, right? He kicked them all out. So very, very important. So anyone who was a Jew, practicing Jew, or any Judaism, any type of active Jew, they were being kicked out. It's very important. But a proselyte, was important to know about a proselyte that they exist in that area. Now, the reason why I'm showing you that is connect this. Let's go back over here. Let's go back to this note over here. Over here. All right, so let's get a little understanding. So in that area, we would have multiple Jewish proselytes, converted Christians. Now, what does that mean? Tell me now. Be honest. Just anyone who understands any type of understanding to what I just said. Is the promised land based upon that information alone? Because remember, always remember this. After the time of Cyrus, right? Remember, Jerusalem was in its place. It fell by the Babylonians. They was in a 70-year captivity. Cyrus came there. He felt zealous by the prophecies. He wrote a thing, which was the Cyrus cylinder. This is the Cyrus cylinder. If you've never seen the Cyrus cylinder before, the Cyrus cylinder is with cuneiform. It writes up all this dialogue and commandments and things that they wanted. The Cyrus cylinder, right? Very important. It's going to be a cuneiform writing of how they basically wanted the people to go back to the land and to build up basically the city, right? The Cyrus cylinder. Let me close this one. I'm gonna close some of these things as I go, because I'm making open a lot of these. I don't want to open too much. But the Cyrus cylinder was what they had illustrated. Now remember, the Cyrus cylinder, they illustrated that they can go back to the same land that was destroyed. That's what makes it important. So they went back to the same place where Jerusalem was brought to ruin, the same place. Where's the same place that they were brought to ruin? Is it in America? Was Jerusalem is the promised land in America, in the lands of Mexico, the ancient lands of Mexico, or in South America? Is any of these places the promised land if we got proselytes that close to them? What's important is there's external history about the promised land. No, the promised land is right above Ethiopia, right? Because a long time ago, this was Abyssinia, Abyssinia. I'm probably saying that weird, but in Egypt, right? This is where Egypt is, and this is where Africa was, right? Libya was the area that the Arabs took. Very important. They settled here. Where is Israel? Right here. That's just an important piece of information for anyone that's trying to say that the land of the Levant is not the land of Israel. This is the land of Israel. That's very important. In fact, genetically, we already confirmed that the people homeland was there. We've been doing this for a long time. If you type down Natufian homeland, the Natufian homeland is right in the Levant. In fact, the Natufian homeland is right in the style of Israel. It goes around, it bends around Sidon and is the E haplogroup. The E haplogroup's homeland is here, not anywhere else, but here. In fact, we actually find the earliest civilizations began over here. We're talking about the modern civilizations because obviously Mount Arad, and from here they spread from these areas, right? Very important. Talks about that in the early biblical narrative, right? They got off at the river Euphrates, which is talked about throughout all history. Euphrates never changed, right? That's very important. So the Natufian homeland is in the Levant. That's very important. The E haplogroups, right? Shemites. E haplogroups are Shemites. Very important. That's just a very important piece of information. The reason why I'm pointing that out is because that's one of the major things to understand. That if we put the promised land, that already makes half of the information that's said on this page false, which is saying the promised land is in America, which the promised land cannot be in America, because why would he complain about other proselytes being on a whole other side of the world? That's very important to understand. But we know that the proselytes are right next to the homeland because they want to be near salvation. That's very important. Very, very important. Now, let me show you something here real fast. Let me show you something here on this one real fast. Let me go here to something on here. Let's go to right here. Now let's talk about that Gnosticism. Let's get on that Gnosticism real fast.
Who's credited for writing most of these books, right, in the New Testament? We'll see. You guys already know the answer. Yeah, I'm going to bring it there. I'm going to show you who this guy is. All right, I'm talking about Paul. All right, so that's in the future parts. Again, Serapis, as you can see, he attributed his his ideas and his portraits or images to Jesus or Christianity. Serapis, who looks just like Zeus, this is what they were putting in the temple. This is what Eliezer was fighting. All right, this is what they were trying to push on the Hebrews. Again, you can find numerous articles, scholarly books on this Serapis, a hybrid cult during the early Christian period in Rome.
All right, so is this Serapis a hybrid? I'm actually going to show you something today. Let me just jump to the bottom and just show you the answer real fast. I'm just going to read something. I'm going to read something about this stuff. The cult of the god of Hermes, because the connection with that is going to connect Hermes and Thoth. The cult of the god of Hermes is essentially a form of pagan Gnosticism. We already talked about Gnosticism on one of the videos before when we were first starting out on this. We already talked about Gnosticism. If you want to see that, I'll put a timestamp on that and go right to the writings of those things. But let's go back up because we're going to take our time and break this down. So first, let's get an understanding. As always, these things are for fair use. We're not using this to gain any money or anything like that. We're just doing this obviously for the truth's sake. So let me show you this real fast.
Was Jesus based on the Egyptian god Serapis? Many mysticists doubt Jesus ever existed and believe he was copied from the Greek and Egyptian god Serapis because Serapis was called the Good Shepherd. He was considered a healer and a miracle worker. Christianity took the Seraphim practices of using lights, bells, processions, and music. They look identical in depictions. Serapis was a sacrificial bull, and Christ was a sacrificial lamb. he was annually sacrificed for the sins of Egypt. And there is a letter from the Emperor Hadrian, which says the worshippers of Serapis were called Christians and had bishops of Christ. So with that, do we have evidence Jesus was a copy of the god Serapis? Well, not really, and the scholarship behind this reveals this is all nonsense. First, I can find absolutely no evidence in ancient records Serapis was ever called the Good Shepherd. The second one, of course, is too general, since all deities are said to do this. The third one has no evidence of any direct connections. Using things like music and lights were used for almost all deities, and this is far too general. We have no evidence that Christian usage of these things was identical to the worship of Serapis. So unless we can get any details which show identical worship or direct dependence, this one has no evidence. To claim they look identical is absurd. Almost all men of that period had similar hair and beards, mainly because that was the customary way for men to look, and they didn't have cheap razors you could buy at the grocery store. Only the wealthy Roman elite could afford to keep themselves clean-shaven. By this logic, almost every man must be a copy of Serapis if he has a beard. Since a lamb and a bull have no real connection, the issue is over whether or not they are both sacrificed in the same way, and the evidence shows this is nonsense as well.
By the way, we're gonna talk about what Christ looked like. You know, we got detailed descriptions of what Christ looked like. We're gonna talk about that. Now we actually got some very detailed descriptions, right, of what Christ looked like. We're gonna talk about some things on this thing. But first, matter of fact, I'll go up and talk about these detailed descriptions of what Christ looked like. There's a book that he uses, and the guy in the book makes a conclusion. And the conclusion that he makes is that the copies of Flavius Josephus, the earliest ones, are from the 17th century. Now, what's interesting about that is that that person doesn't actually know that Flavius Josephus actually also has Slavic copies. He also has Hebrew copies, early Hebrew copies and early Slavic copies that were copied. We're going to talk about that. Let's talk about it in the details of it on these things real fast. Let me just go down to something and talk about that. And we're going to talk about what Messiah looked like. You're going to be surprised what he actually looked like and whatnot to get a more detailed understanding picture of what he looked like. Let me make sure I grab this one real fast. In fact, it's right here. I just want to show you the timestamp of this thing, though. Let me make sure I go to that so we can check that out. So this is going to be some writings, but before I even go to it, right here, let me just show you something from his one of these things he say right here. Let me just show you something what he says right here on 12. I'm going to show you what he says here. Now watch what he says here. I'm going to show you something that this person, the person that he's reading from, doesn't know that much. Watch what he shows here.
Eliezer be Ananias. Eliezer. Equally odd is Josephus' silence as to the fate of Eliezer.
All right, hold on. Not this part. This one is for. We're going to talk about Peso and Eliezer in another video. We're going to get detail into Peso and Eliezer in another video. I'm going to just separate these because these two are going to be very important to go over separately. Today we're focusing on Messiah and this Gnosticism, connecting Messiah with it. So just to get a little understanding. Let me just go down a little bit. Just to get a little understanding. But this just goes into a little information. This basically connects with it, but I'm just going to talk about it. Basically, what it is, this is a copy that he ended up talking about. He'll end up talking about this copy. Let me just make sure I really want to show the timestamp 3844. Let me show this timestamp, what he says here. Right here, 3844. Now watch what he says here. Let me just make sure this is the spot. 3844. All right, watch this.
I'm going to leave it there for you guys to figure out, but I just wanted to go ahead and point that out. It shows a little bit of what was going on during these times that we're talking about, during the Piso's time when they were trying to create Christianity and Messiah. And then Masada. Those three historical battles or wars really wasn't really.
Hold on, let me just make sure I put the right here. So this 3844. In fact, let me make sure I'm quoting from the because a few other ones. It's this one, this video. And make sure this was it. This is 3. Yeah, it was this video. All right, let me make sure. I probably put a weird timestamp. Let me just make
also
sure
knew that while
it's not too hard to find real fast. I'm just gonna go to it.
to the Most High, the Great Spirit, like
Make sure a little bit. In fact, I think I timestamped the wrong spot, so I'm just gonna scroll to it real fast,
left
or
an
I'll
example
talk about it. Basically, there's a spot where he talks about Josephus' writings in the 17th century.
into
I'm
religion.
gonna try to find it real fast while I'm talking about it. I'll just quickly explain it. Basically, what he talks about is that Josephus' writings, yes, the main copies of Josephus' writings is from the 1700s. That's the one that basically is highly accessible. That's the one that many people have now. Is the one from the 1700s, but it's extremely false to say that's the only copy, or the only copy that's available for us to check. But the copies that we have older copies. I'm just looking to see if I can find that one real fast. I probably timestamped the wrong spot. I put 38 44, which I don't think is 3844. I think it's somewhere else. I'll find it later and fix that timestamp. Put a timestamp right there on what spot it is. But basically, I'll put a timestamp later on what it is, what spot it is. Oh, right here. There it is. Okay, so let me play it real fast. I probably put
and Winston's translation of the word
all right, so
used
right
by just
here.
print version
Let's go back a little
Jesus'
bit.
ministry.
All right, so
It becomes clear that it is all taken from another book. The ministry of Jesus parallels the military campaign of the Roman Titus Flavius. All right, again, during the siege of Jerusalem, that story that Josephus writes about, the siege, is what they're talking about, and how much of that story you can find in the New Testament during the day Jesus is getting crucified. Flavius Josephus recorded the events and activities from the Roman military campaign in Judea, involving Vespasian and Titus, who was partly responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. Is highly recommended Josephus. All right, so you guys can compare yourselves.
All right, so watch this. Watch what he says here. Ready?
Winston was a professor of mathematics at Cambridge University and published his translation of Josephus' work in 1737. His translation is the only single volume widely available. However, the Greek manuscripts he used are now not considered the best.
All right, so let me make sure you can hear me. All right, so let's comment on that. So is his translation the only one? His translation is the best one. This translation is one of the best ones. When they say it's not the best, that's been already been corrected, because the one that he has shown. Let me just close some. I'm gonna close some of these while I speak real fast. The one that he has shown.
The word would be EUS.
Close this. The one that he has shown, right, was the one that's one of the better ones. I'm just gonna close some of these so I don't have a lot open here, because I actually have quite a few. I'm just gonna close some of these. All right, let's understand what was he talking about, right? The new complete writings of Flavius Josephus. This is from the 1700s, right? That's one of the oldest ones. Right here is what you're seeing. This is from 1797, right? There's gonna be another copy, right? The whole works of Flavius Josephus. I'm gonna show you an earlier one. This is a later copy, right? Just talks about some things and whatnot. Just go over some very interesting things, right? In this thing, he actually talks about Eliezer in this thing. He actually talks about Eliezer and different individuals in this whatnot. Flavius Josephus talks about a lot of different individuals in his writings when he goes over these things. Very, very deep on this right here. You can see right here. In short, right? In short, they animated the other Jews to take up arms, and Eliezer, the son of Denaeus, in elected to the chief command, right? Just talk about some things, just go a little more detail on those things, right? Just talk about some things. They talk about Eliezer. But let me show you something. Go a little down. Let me show you the Slavic works of Flavius Josephus. I'm going to show you something from the Slavic works of Flavius Josephus, what Messiah looks like. The earliest surviving manuscript of the Slavic Josephus dates to 1463, right? Very important. But it's actually important that those obviously copies was going into basically movement. They talk about basically the Rus. If you know who the Rus is, it's the Russian. The Russia looked like this at first, then it became large, right? The Rus, right? Russia, right? Byzantine historian John Malaz and George so and so to form a single universal history, right? Combine some papers, right? Whatnot, to make a universal history, right? For the copies and everything. And it talks about right here monks and scribes who translated the Jewish wars from the old church Slavic, right? You can see right here in the early 16th century. So the 17 ones are later, the 16 ones are earlier, and the 14 ones are earlier. But it's actually important to note Josephus wrote all his surviving works after his establishment in Rome in 71 AD, right? That's very important because he left. What's important, we'll talk about that. Flavius Josephus leaving Jerusalem, right? Because he was recorded in Jerusalem. He left Jerusalem. And his name was Joseph ben Mataniyahu. And then he got one of Titus Flavius' brothers' names, changing the Joseph to Joseph and gaining the name Flavian, so that he himself, walking around known as a Flavian, is in high ranking by his name, right? Titus Flavian was given to Josephus, right? Very, very important, because remember, they don't have a last name. His name was Joseph, son of Matthew, right? Son of Matthew. But Joseph was given the name Titus Vespasian. I mean, Titus Flavius, right? By Vespasian, by Emperor Vespasian, which we'll talk about the historicity behind him and who he is. Very important. These are all different individuals that do different things and different whatnots. But this is very important. The Slavic writing is the earliest writing of the Jews. Now, let me show you something. So this is just a copy of it and everything from the 16s and everything. Statement was false, but let me show you something. Let me show you something really interesting. Here's a copy if you want to read it, the Slavic writings and everything, or any of the writing and whatnot. This is JPAS, so you got to get JPAS and everything. Go into those things. The Slavic version of Josephus' History of the Jews' Wars. Let me read you something from the Slavic version. Yes, we know that some of the things from the writings of Josephus was removed. We do know that. We do know that some things were removed. But let me show you something. We did a big study, and let me show you something from one of his writings before it got deleted. One of the individuals reading from it. Beniyah, Israel. Let me go to something here. Right. Matter of fact, I'll go to it here so I can just go right to the timestamp. Let me show you a very interesting read, which for some reason I can't find anymore. So I had to quote it from this video. Let me just show you something. Let's see what Messiah looked like.
See this?
So what you're going to see is a reading of what Messiah looked like in the Slavic writings.
Paul. And Flavius Josephus, in the Slavic copy of Christ, that book contains a detailed description of Christ. However, I will point out that the Western copy, if you get it from like the Amazon bookstore, some of these Western copies have this description of Christ deleted. Like in particular, the part that deals with skin, you'll find that this is actually deleted. But since we have a Slavic copy, or a translation of the Slavic copy, let's read what we have. And it says, "At the time there appeared a certain man of magic power. If it be met to call him man, whose name is Yeshua." It says Jesus, but it's Yeshua, because we know there wasn't a J back then. So it's whose name is Yeshua, whom certain Greeks call a son of Yah, but his disciples call the true prophet. Then it says, listen closely, it says, "He was a man of simple appearance, mature age," and get this, "black skinned." And it goes on to say, short in growth, 3 cubits tall, and some other descriptions of Christ. But the main one I wanted to point out there is black skin. It says, "He was a man of simple appearance, mature age, black skin," right?
All right, so you've seen it. The oldest writings of Flavius Josephus actually has a contest that the Jews were dark skinned. Is Flavius Josephus lying? Are the Jews dark skinned? Is the picture of Paul, remember that picture we seen of Paul? Did he look like a black man? Did he look like he's dark skinned? They look like he probably had the classic E haplogroup, which we found in the Natufian, which we found in other places. This first, 2nd century image of Paul and Peter. See this image of Peter right here, and Paul. Look at his nose. Look at him. What did it say? Messiah had black skin. What do you think? Josephus is just a random man popping up saying that all of a sudden these Jews look like this and this is what happened. He's describing the war exactly to a T, talking about all these things, right? Very important. These people are there. They exist, right? We can find multiple historical documents of these individuals because they exist. But we're going to talk about what happened. We're going to talk about the Gnosticism that got confused with these things, go over these things. You can see other individuals talk about these things and whatnot, a lot of other individuals. Let me show you another piece, 1855. Let me show you something right here. Show you another piece, right? Another witness. All right, I'm going to show you this one real fast, right? I'm going to show you something.
Take unto yourselves
1855. All right, I'm going to show you something real fast on here. Right, Josephus, Yeshua hair. He talks about how his hair looks and everything. Talks about different things, but let's see a little bit here.
And hands full of novel. So, Flavius Josephus, as he talks about Yeshua's dark skin, he was a man of simple appearance, dark. The famous word that the reconstructors use is ruddy. This particular painting is said to actually be one of the oldest paintings of Yeshua and Miriam. And I want to credit Shako, in her work was featured here in this Wikipedia piece where I got it from. But this is 13th century, and it's in the Kremlin Museum. So grateful, just to find these things. Yeah, it is said to traditionally have been painted by Saint Luke. We don't know, but that's the tradition. Okay. So when you read in Psalm 22:6,
so I'm gonna pause it. So that's a second source. We can talk about this individual had talked about it too, but understand this is one of those things in the early surviving manuscript of the Slavic copies of Josephus. So very important what we're looking at there. We're looking at some of the writings of Flavius Josephus, right? He talks about Eliezer and things like that. He talks about the battles and everything. He talks about individuals that were killed. But remember, we read that Eliezer converted to Christianity. So Eliezer ended up getting convinced in his own heart, realizing that the Most High actually did send this individual to die for his sins, and that he can have a way of salvation, right? Very important that he himself was trying to find a way. We'll talk about Eliezer too. We'll go into depth as Eliezer. Let's get back to the understanding here. So now let's get back into the little details of the Gnosticism. Now, what's interesting that the individual makes a conclusion. He makes a conclusion that Hermes and Thoth, or one of the individuals of the land of what's the word I'm looking for? Egypt, is that Moses is connected to. Let's continue with this little video first, because this is another individual that he connects them to. I want to show you that is incorrect first before we go to Thoth and Hermes. It's actually an old connection with Thoth and Hermes that we'll talk about that goes with Gnosticism. And that's why you see in some writings, you'll see that it says it's connected to Christians. What type of Christians? Remember, the Gnostics were supposedly called Christians, but the Gnostic doctrine is different than the original Christian doctrine. That's very important. We'll talk about that. But first, let's talk about this individual.
Jesus was willingly sacrificed for the sins of the world, whereas Serapis had nothing like this. In truth, Serapis was a blended deity, the combination of Osiris and Apis. Apis was a sacred bull, worshipped in Memphis, who was said to have died and then in the underworld became one with Osiris to become Osirapis, which was Serapis in the Hellenistic period of Egypt. This is nothing like the story of Jesus, and vague similarities don't cut it. The next one is strange. Jesus was not annually sacrificed. I think mysticists are confusing the celebration of Easter, where we remember Jesus' victory over sin and death, and assuming it is where Jesus has to die again every year. This is an absolutely ridiculous way to look at Christianity, and it is a joke to assume this is remotely true. The final one is the most used to argue for myth borrowing. People like Ray Hagens and Robert Taylor will claim there is an early letter written by the Emperor Hadrian, which says a group in Egypt called themselves Christians and worshipped Serapis. They claim this is clear evidence Christianity evolved from Serapis worship. However, there are so many problems with this supposed letter. First, even if the letter was legitimate, it would date to 134 AD, which is long after Christianity started, and it is equally likely Serapis worshippers borrowed from Christians who were spreading the gospel in that region. We already know Serapis worshippers were prone to syncretism, so if the letter was authentic, it would be more likely the Serapis cult borrowed from Christians. However, the letter is most likely a forgery, and that is how most scholars recognize it. The letter is found in a late 4th century collection of forged biographies called the Historia Augusta. The reason scholars think this is because it is filled with anachronisms.
So what is the individual talking about? Is he saying that this paper is constantly talked about? They'll say, well, did you know that the Christians, they also was part of this person, right? Serapis, or how you say his name, right? Do you know that there's a copy, there's a paper, there's a document, what you seen this Historia Augusta, that actually says that was a falsified paper. That's very important. From the 1st to the 2nd century, even 3rd century, it's important to know that they basically made a collection of papers that they knew that were basically fake, right? They knew that a lot of these documents were fake documents because that's what people were doing. They were doing a lot of bogus stuff. But the thing is, with history and truth, you can take things and cross-reference it to find what's true. That's very important. But let's continue to hear what it said here, because you'll see little different things said of weird things, and that's because some people don't know history that well with these things, and they probably got also a hate themselves for the truth. So that's very important. But it goes into, this thing has a lot of detail into different writings. They'll talk about that writing and everything and whatnot, and different things like that and everything. But let's hear a little more of what he's saying here. Goes on in a little more detail.
And it is pretty obvious in the Serapis letter itself. Hadrian was only in Egypt in 130 AD. However, it mentions his adopted son, who Hadrian did not accept until 136 AD. It also mentions Servianus as consul, but he did not receive the position until 134 AD. This is why even the most liberal scholars, like Walter Baer, reject the authenticity of this letter. Glanville Bowersock says, "The presence of fiction in the Historia Augusta is by now an established fact. The mischievous author of this work pretended, as we all know, to be writing historical biographies. But this pretense, though compelling the inclusion of genuine historical material, imposed no perceptible limits on his wit and invention." So since that is the case, there is no evidence Jesus was just a myth based on Serapis.
All right, so if you see somebody try to bring up that idea and try to connect those two together, it's because they don't know history and they don't know about this document that confirmed that connection, right? That connection was a falsified connection, and you'll see a lot of people talk about it. In fact, what they'll do is say they'll just skip the fact that it was confirmed fake, and they'll say, well, it was said, though, even though it was fake, that person did say it was connected. Let's talk about that connection real fast. Very important. What really are they connecting? Because what you're really going to be seeing here is a major connection to a type of Christian set called the Gnostics. We're going to look at that, but it's going to be connecting to the Gnostics. So he says, obviously, it's going to be connections, but what's important is a lot of people that connect Hermes and Thoth together, they're not really the same. Hermes and Thoth are not the same. There is something that's the same, and we'll talk about that, what becomes the same of these two beliefs. One is from Egypt with Greek rumors, and one is from Greece with Egyptian rumors. That's very important. A lot of people talk about it. They'll say, basically, are these two the same and everything? We're not going to go into their questions and answers and everything, whatnot, but we're going to get into actual historical information, right? They just talk about some things, right? They talk about these two the same and everything, and what you'll see people, it says, depending on who you ask. If you ask the Greeks, they'll say yes. Sometimes you ask somebody, they'll say yes, of course, but it's complicated or things like that. Or they'll say no. But let's go over here and talk about the direct historical understanding on these things, right? Others talk about this. They say, obviously, these direct two idols are not the same, right? I'm not going to go into this video, but here's an individual that gets really deep into it. I'm just going to show you a little bit of what he says here at 440, right? He's probably deep into this stuff, but even he knows while being deep into these stuff, Hermes is not Thoth. These two individuals are different.
Text of the tablet is written in the Phoenician alphabet using ancient Phoenician character glyphs. The tablet states its author as Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice greatest.
So I don't know if you heard what he just said. What he basically said, there's a difference between Thoth and Hermes, but there's a combination with Hermes thrice, or the greatest, thrice the greatest. We're going to talk about that. That's an individual who's a combination of Hermes and Thoth. That's what we're going to talk about. This person right here. This person right here, we're going to talk about real fast. But just to get a little understanding, is this, and I'm going to just quickly give you a summary of what it is. Basically, what it is, Hermes thrice greatest, what it basically is a legendary, obviously Hellenistic, right? Helen, right? Meaning coming from the Greeks. The word Helen is not also connected with the word hell. That's an English linguistic problem that's not connected. That's actually coming from the word meaning Gentile, Helen, right? Hellenistic. Further, at that originated, just talking about basically a combination, right? This person is actually not the original Hermes. That's very important. He's a combination of the Greek idol Hermes and the Egyptian idol Thoth. That's very important. This makes a new belief. This new belief is going to be connected with the Gnostics. It's very important. Let's keep on going. Let me show you something here, right here, the 220. All right. Let me show you something. So there's going to be a historian reviewing another historian.
Latin and Coptic.
These type of things are always really interesting. Always get a second view on those things.
This is a strong reason for doubting the purely Egyptian origin of the philosophy of the Hermetic text.
They were collated in the city of Alexandria in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Here, the Hermetic philosophy helped inspire some of the greatest intellectual achievements of the ancient world.
He deliberately uses the word collated instead of the word written. We know the bulk of the Hermetic texts were written during this period because they are in Greek and Coptic. We don't know that they were merely collated. We don't have any evidence they were translated from Egyptian either. But now Gandhi gives his reason for why he thinks they were collated from earlier Egyptian sources.
Alexandria was a great center of learning, surpassing even Athens. Its founder, Alexander the Great, had conquered and united Greece, Persia, Egypt, and India into one vast empire. Cultures that had grown up more or less independently were brought together, and there was no bigger melting pot than Alexandria. Into this new cosmopolis, or universal city, poured men and women of every race and nation: Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, and even Buddhists from India, associated here together in relative peace. The Alexandrians were renowned for their thirst for knowledge, and under the enlightened Greek ruler Ptolemy I, a library and museum were founded where human beings first systematically collected the wisdom of the world. At its height, the Library of Alexandria housed some 500,000
Egyptian ideas. Properly, he is saying that since the Library of Alexandria had hundreds of thousands of scrolls collected from all over, they must have had scrolls of ancient Egyptian wisdom. Therefore, the philosophy of the Hermetic texts could easily have been taken from earlier Egyptian texts. All this does, however, is show the possibility that the Hermetica could contain Egyptian ideas. Gandhi would have to agree it doesn't prove that the Hermetica is wholly Egyptian. Anyway, modern scholars are of the opinion that the Hermetica draws from the ancient Egyptian tradition. No one argues that the Hermetic texts are 100% Greek in origin. This is a synthesis, after all. It brings together Greek ideas and Egyptian ones. And the very fact that the intellectuals of Alexandria were gathering wisdom from many different places is evidence in favor of a mixing of ideas. The point here is that the Hermetica can't be older than the Hellenistic period because its existence requires the interaction between the Egyptians and the Greeks.
The Golden Age of Alexandria came to an end with the birth of the intolerant Christian, Holy Roman Empire. Despite the sophistication and cultural achievements of the ancients, the Christians referred to them dismissively as pagans, which means country dweller. In 415 CE, Hypatia, one of the last great scientists and pagan philosophers working at the Library of Alexandria, was seized by a mob of Christians who removed her flesh with scallop shells and burnt her remains. Their leader, Bishop Cyril, was later canonized Saint Cyril. The great library was finally destroyed as so much pagan superstition, and this wealth of knowledge was scattered to the wind. The Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius closed pagan temples across the empire and began the previously unknown phenomenon of book burning.
What Gandhi appears to be trying to do here is make it seem as if the Christian church tried to wipe out the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, and unfairly at that. It's certainly true that pagan religion was the target of Christian attacks, but it would be too simplistic to say that they tried to eradicate all pagan ideas. There were many pagan ideas that were accepted by Christians and made their way into Christianity. The fact is, Hypatia, in her time, was beloved by both pagans and Christians. She wasn't murdered because she was a pagan. She was murdered for political reasons. She had been the advisor of the Roman prefect of Egypt, a Christian, who was in the middle of a dispute with the Archbishop Cyril of Alexandria. It was thought she was getting in the way of the two reconciling, and she was killed for it. But many Christians mourned her death, and in the Middle Ages, she was even upheld as a symbol of Christian virtue. The library had already been in decline for some centuries, and many of its books had been sent to other libraries. What was left of the main library was destroyed either in 272, when the Emperor Aurelian was fighting to take back Alexandria from Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, or in 297, when the Emperor Diocletian laid siege to the city. These events occurred long before Cyril was ever born. As for the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, it was embraced, perhaps not by all, but certainly by some Christians, including influential leaders. Clement of Alexandria, a Christian theologian and head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, was one. Lactantius, Christian advisor to Constantine the Great, was another. Many Gnostic Christians also embraced it.
For the West,
All right, so very important. Some of the names that he mentioned, those are going to be Gnostics. We're going to talk about Gnostic Christianity. This is very important. And we're going to talk about some of the individuals. Clement of Alexandria. You heard that name, Clement of Alexandria? Who is he talking about? Clement of Alexandria. Let me show you first what this belief is. What is this belief and what's going on with it? What's important is the belief that I'm showing you is a combination of two beliefs, right? The Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes merged, right? Merged in the Roman Empire to become a cult figure, right? Very important to talk about this merging, right? They merged together. It's very important. I'm going to go down and talk about something real fast down here. Just talks about some of the things, right? Obviously, Thoth was before Hermes. And then Hermes came during the time of the rise of the Greeks, right? The kingdom of the Greeks rising, right? Then Hermes basically mixed with this idol Thoth, right? Thoth is a very earlier one and whatnot, with magic and all types of stuff and whatnot. Let's go down a little bit, right? Just going to talk about some things. Here's what I want to show you, right? Thoth transformed. We're going to talk about the combination that happens when the Greeks went to Egypt. When the Greeks came into Egypt, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, so remember Alexander, right? Coming from Greece, historically, Alexander the Great, he comes out of Greece. He takes these areas. He takes pretty much all these areas. He takes Egypt too. So he takes pretty much all these areas from the Persians, right? So you talk about that time, right? That's 400 BC, 300 BC, 300 BC, 5th century BC, or 4th century BC. It says, when the Greeks came to Egypt after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, they absorbed many important Egyptian deities into their sets of idols, right? Obviously, the idol Thoth is one of them, right? The Greeks assumed that Thoth and the god Hermes must be the same person, right? So they mixed them together. Long story short, they came with a new person, no longer named Thoth nor Hermes, but it is Hermes, basically better, basically what they mean. I'm gonna just go down and just show you it word for word down here, how it goes down. What happened next is obscure. We don't know quite how Hermes was transformed under the Greek rule, but Greek Egypt soon fell to the Romans. Now this is where it comes down. Remember, the Greeks are the ones that merged this individual, but the Romans are a mix of the Greeks and these different individuals. Like the Romans, a lot of people don't know, but there are a lot of Caucasian-looking E1B1B groups, which are like Arabs and stuff. They would be related with Israel. So they're like Arabs that were settling up in the north. A lot of them settled in Spain. And they came out of Spain. Basically, if you look it up, E1B1B had a high portion over here. This group over here came out of Spain and attacked the Greeks. They attacked the Greeks and they took over these areas, and they owned this area and they owned these areas. It's very important. This group came out of here. These were the real Romans. The original Romans came from here, and then they settled over here. They were over here too. Like the Romans were like connected over here, but they came over here. The Greeks were over here, right? Then these became the Romans later on. Now I was going to talk about the Romans. It's very important to get a little understanding about the Romans. Let's talk about the Romans. Obviously, they were happy, right? Quite happy to obviously incorporate multiple versions of the same God into their religious tradition, because they had many gods. A lot of nations have many gods. They don't care about adding extra gods. They don't care about alterations or anything like that. The Christians do. Real Christians do. Real believers do. But what you're seeing here, obviously, is going to be an understanding that must be understood. That the first Romans, the first people, they didn't care. They don't. People usually, when they get idols and made up stories, they don't care about alterations. So they were quick to take it in. They was quick to take it in and whatnot. So they obviously mixed in with the belief, right? Now let's talk about the Hermetic writings. The first time you ever hear of this mixture, this combination, right? The Herma, basically times 3, what you see in there. One of the earliest mentions of the idol was mentioned by Clement of Alexandria. Now you'll say that, oh, that's a Christian, right? Because that's a Christian of Alexandria. You gotta know about the different sets. If you don't know about these different sets, you might be taken for a ride. What's very important is this individual, Clement of Alexandria, was not a pure Christian. This individual was actually more of an idol worshiper than anything. Let me actually go to something here. Let me actually copy it and show you something real fast. Clement of Alexandria. Just gonna copy this. Right? There's different people who exist, real saints. But Clement of Alexandria, let's get a little understanding on what he did and whatnot, a little information of what he was doing, right? Just talks about him being there and everything. Gonna go down a little bit and talk about some things, right? Just talk about Clement reached Alexandria and stuff, and he had some writings and everything on some things and whatnot. Matter of fact, I might play a little video on it just to show a little something about it. And talk about what he was doing and everything. But let's go down. All right, so watch what it says here. He says Clement is supportive of women playing an active role in the leadership of the church. Is that the way that Paul said that women could be in the leadership of the church? Be honest. If you know the writings of Paul, guess what Paul says? He says that a woman's supposed to be silent in the church, but Clement thought differently. And he provides a list of women he considered, but obviously inspirational, which includes both biblical and classical Greek figures. You think that woman was one of them? It has been suggested that Clement's process views on gender as set out in this word here were influenced by Gnosticism. What is it saying here? It's saying that this individual actually was influenced by Gnostics. What is Gnostics? However, later in the work, he argues against the Gnostic faith. He's trying to say he's not convinced by Gnostics, but you'll see that he had, obviously, like you saw there, some influence by the Gnostics. We're getting deeper. We're going to start learning about the Gnostic faith. What are Gnostics? What are the Gnostics? They're different. The Gnostic groups are different groups. You'll see the Christians, the believers, original believers will rebuke them. But let's continue reading with a little bit of this. So he had talked about them, right? He had wrote about them and stuff like that. He said he believes that Hermes wrote 42 sacred books containing all world's knowledge, right? Just talk about some things other people had talked about it. So he was a Gnostic. He wrote that he was writing about this individual saying that, oh, he had some knowledge. He actually had some knowledge and some things, whatnot. So when they're saying a Christian had this, he wasn't really a Christian. He was a Gnostic. In fact, it talks about it was a rival to Jesus. Why? Because we're going to talk about some things that happened in time, how some individuals actually went on a whole war against them, against Gnosticism. We talked about that before in the previous video, right? That's why we went into Gnosticism. Right? So what's important is, let's go back over here, just got some other things and everything. So remember, Gnosticism looks like Christian work, but they are paganism. They believe in Christ, but they added on a lot of crazy stuff. You got to know the difference between these groups, because these are two different early groups. We'll get a little more detail into it. So this is a real thing. This is remember, it's not just Hermes, but it's this Hermes, the thrice greatest. Very important, right? A combination of Thoth and Hermes, very important. Very, very important, right? Get a little understanding on these things. Let me just make sure we already got looked on this. Going back over here. All right. In fact, we already clicked that. So a little bit more down. In fact, let me make sure that's it. Right here. Yeah, we talked about this, right? Just making sure that was I just had 2 copies just in case. Go down. His screenshot. Let me read you something here. Like we had read, the writings of Hermes, known as the Hermetria, or how you say that, Hermetica, something like that. Now watch what it says here. Attached a cult following and were influenced. Now note what it says here, because I'm going to show you that this group did not influence the Christians. They actually was influenced by the Christians, because this latter group is actually from the influence of the Christians. The Christians are the ones that influenced them, not that they influenced the Christians. It's very important. But you'll note that some Christian writers or some Christians secretly was also working with them. The writings of Hermes, known as Hermetria, I probably said that weird, attached the cult following. Let me make sure I plug this up, because when this thing dies, it's like takes a long time to come back on. Make sure I got this thing plugged up. All right. I think my charger is messing up or something. It's probably going bad. That's all right. All right. All right, so obviously it says were influenced by Egyptian religion, Jewish and early Christian ideas, and Greek philosophy. That's what actually influenced them, right? That's very important. Because listen to what they say. There's a quote unquote from there. The cult of the god of Hermes was essentially a form of pagan Gnosticism. Remember, a branch of Christianity is also Gnosticism. But it's very important. They're different. They're very different. If you ever run into anybody who talks about different idols and stuff, I put a great playlist here by Inspiring Philosophy. If they say Jesus is Horus, look at this video. If they say there are any of these idols, look at any of these videos. There'll be a rebuke for any of those confusion that anyone tried to mix up. Very important. There's a major difference between these individuals. But let's look at something. So you probably heard of the Good Shepherd. You probably heard of that with early Christianity. But let's understand something with the Good Shepherd. I'm going to show you something here. This Christianity is actually Gnosticism.
We're in the part of the Vatican museums that is devoted to early Christian art. We've walked by sarcophagi, the covers of tombs from the catacombs, and we've come upon a rare example of early Christian sculpture.
Early Christian freestanding sculpture, that is, everything that we've been looking at pretty much is relief sculpture. And of course, ancient Rome was known for its large freestanding sculptures, but they were associated for Christians with images of gods and emperors, and so not something the first Christians wanted to emulate. There was also the association of
Quick message, just to let you know. All right, it talks about how the Christians didn't allow these images. It's very important. They didn't allow these images. In fact, let's get into the understanding of it, of the writings of the real Christians that rebuke this Gnosticism. Right, we're going to show you first century Christians that were going against those Gnostic Christians. Very, very important. This is why it was written to Timothy by Paul. Right, having a form of godliness. He was talking about those individuals, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning, but never able to come to knowledge of the truth. Right? Then it talks about these ancient individuals who withstood Moses, right? Kind of like some individuals that was working magic, right? They was resisting the truth, men of corrupt minds, right? Reprobate concerning the faith, right? But they shall, just like anybody who's saying any of this crazy modern Gnosticism, right? But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest to all men, as theirs also was. Very important. Just talk about some of those things, little historical documents on these individuals with Moses and whatnot. But let me show you something now from the archive. Let me show you this person here. This person basically rebukes a lot of that hedonism. We had talked about him
Irenaeus
before.
was an overseer.
We talked about Irenaeus before. Remember, Irenaeus was an individual we were talking about when we were talking about Gnosticism, right? We talk about Gnosticism over here, right? Irenaeus, he was one of the I call him like the top four: Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen, and Irenaeus. These individuals were basically like Titus against the Gnosticism that was going on at that time. They were basically fighting against the heresies of that time, all the heresies. We had talked about that that last live when we was going over these things. But let's keep on. Let's continue and understand who is he, and what was he fighting against. Let's get an understanding of this individual, right? There's difference between these Christian groups.
In Gaul, which is modern-day Lyons, France, around AD 180. He was probably a native of Smyrna because, as a boy, he was a personal student of Polycarp. Therefore, there are only 2 degrees of separation between Irenaeus and the Apostle John. Hippolytus was one of his students. Unlike many of his contemporary writers, Irenaeus was raised in a Christian family. Having grown up in the eastern side of the Roman Empire and later living in the western side, Irenaeus became an important link in the church. He was so respected that when an argument arose between the bishops of Rome and the bishops of Asia Minor over when to celebrate Pascha, that is, Christ's resurrection, he intervened and brought peace. Irenaeus' most famous work is called Against Heresies, in which he battled many religions that opposed Christianity, especially Gnosticism and its utter absurdities. He began his journey of cataloging heresies when he visited Rome in the 170s. There, he rebuked friends as well as the Bishop of Rome for embracing strange doctrines. His work explains the beliefs of many pagan religions of the 2nd century with incredible accuracy. Irenaeus was martyred in AD 202 during the persecution under Emperor Septimius Severus. About Irenaeus, pre-Nicene Christians wrote, "There is Irenaeus, that very exact inquirer into all doctrines." The blessed presbyter Irenaeus has powerfully and elaborately refuted the opinions of these heretics. Who is ignorant of the books of Irenaeus and Melito and the rest, which declare Christ to be God and man?
So what do we know so far? So very important. We already seen the historical documents on the first early saints. We've seen a little bit about Josephus. We've seen that they was all at the place. We've seen Messiah. We got some images of Paul and Peter, some descriptions of Messiah and the individuals. Now let's see what this first remember, this is a disciple of the disciple of John. So this is very important. So that means John had a disciple, and this will be a disciple of John's disciple. That's very important. So he's writing, having those first century understandings. He's going to be writing something very important. We need to understand what he says here. So let me show you something here. What he actually writes concerning Gnostics. I'm just going to show you a quick rebuke.
Against Heresies by St. Irenaeus of Lyon. Book 3, Chapter 24.
Let's hear what he says.
Recapitulation of the various arguments adduced against Gnostic impiety under all its aspects. The heretics, tossed about by every blast of doctrine, are opposed by the uniform teaching of the Church, which remains so always and is consistent with itself. Thus, then, have all these men been exposed, who bring in impious doctrines regarding our Maker and Framer, who also formed this world, and above whom there is no other God. And those have been overthrown by their own arguments, who teach falsehoods regarding the substance of our Lord, and the dispensation which he fulfilled for the sake of his own creature, man. But, on the other hand, it has been shown that the preaching of the Church is everywhere consistent, and it continues in an even course, and receives testimony from the prophets, the apostles, and all the disciples, as I have proved, through those in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and through the entire dispensation of God, and that well-grounded system which tends to man's salvation, namely our faith, which having been received from the Church we do preserve, and which always, by the Spirit of God, renewing its youth as it were some precious deposit in an excellent vessel, causes the vessel itself containing it to renew its youth also. For this gift of God has been entrusted to the Church as breath was to the first created man, for this purpose, that all the members receiving it may be vivified, and the means of communion with Christ has been distributed throughout it. That is, the Holy Spirit, the earnest of incorruption, the means of confirming our faith, and the ladder of ascent to God. For in the Church, it is said, God has set apostles, prophets, teachers, and all the other means through which the Spirit works, of which all those are not partakers who do not join themselves to the Church, but defraud themselves of life through their perverse opinions and infamous behavior. For where the Church is, there is the Spirit of God, and where the Spirit of God is, there is the Church, and every kind of grace. But the Spirit is truth. Those, therefore, who do not partake of him are neither nourished into life from the mother's breasts, nor do they enjoy that most limpid fountain which issues from the body of Christ. But they dig for themselves broken cisterns out of earthly trenches, and drink putrid water out of the mire, fleeing from the faith of the Church, lest they be convicted, and rejecting the Spirit, that they may not be instructed. Alienated thus from the truth, they do deservedly wallow in all error, tossed to and fro by it, thinking differently in regard to the same things at different times, and never attaining to a well-grounded knowledge, being more anxious to be sophists of words than disciples of the truth. For they have not been founded upon the one rock, but upon the sand, which has in itself a multitude of stones. Wherefore they also imagine many gods, and they always have the excuse of searching after truth, for they are blind, but never succeed in finding it. For they blaspheme the Creator, him who is truly God, who also furnishes power to find the truth, imagining that they have discovered another God beyond God, or another pleroma, or another dispensation. Wherefore also the light which is from God does not illumine them, because they have dishonored and despised God, holding him of small account, because through his love and infinite benignity he has come within reach of human knowledge.
All right, so I want to show something real fast. 'Cause I thought what this person was talking about was pretty interesting. Yeah, it's true that he said or she said something really interesting, real fast. I was just looking at it real fast. Was talk about was just studying about Pharaoh's commissioning and everything. Talks about he had basically had 72 Hebrews to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Was about 600 BC. It's definitely possible. It's definitely possible because I was finding some information that was basically talk about some of the pottery that was fine. I don't know why I can't click this little thing. I probably had to copy it. I don't know why I can't click this thing. Maybe I can copy it. Let me see. Or somehow, some way. I'll try to copy it somehow, some way. But basically, you know, it's something that's found. Actually, I could probably just find it real fast. Let me just find it real fast. Yeah, there's evidence. Let me just type it away. Of a new yeah, there is some evidence on that. They do have some different places. I'm sure you can get a little more deep into it, but it did come out in 2016 when they was talking about they did find some basically information. Um, it's writing though. That's one of the thing. It might not be like what you would say scripture, but it would be like findings of the ancient Paleo Hebrew writings. So that's very early writings. That's going to be obviously after the pictographic. So that's going to be writing that we would expect to see in that time. That's right before. That's the writing that Moses was writing with the Paleo Hebrew. So it just basically letting us know that writing style was still used in. But that's a very interesting one. 72 individuals. That one we'll have to look a little more into, and maybe we'll go over that if we find something on that. That's fairly interesting. We'll look into that. But just for clarity, this individual, right? If you heard what he said, he has multiple pieces of writing, right? This is one of his books, his another book. He basically writes. You can see it from the titles. He basically rebukes Gnosticism, right? He rebukes the Gnosticism. He rebukes the ideas. He talks about all the details, all the idols. He talks about where did Gnosticism come from, the Simon Magus, right? It talks about then in book of Acts that this was a deceiver, right? He talks about all those things that basically they were dealing with people trying to alter information. But remember, the belief that is connected to the so-called Christians that is connected to are not the real Christians. The real Christians kept away. We can follow that throughout history. Here's a book called The Martyr's Mirror. It has basically quotes from Christians from the first to the 5th century. And remember, about this time, 1699 or 1611, that's when you get your King James version written. So you can see these accounts, right? You can see first century accounts of martyrs and stuff right here. And these are going to be like quotes. Obviously, your earliest sources are going to be the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative is going to be your earliest sources for some of those things, your first century things like that, early sources. They'll give you details of things, but they also have other sources that talk about those of the first century and whatnot. You can see different ones, right? Moreover, the third letter of Clements, right, just talks about some of those things, right? Early first century writings. You can see. I'm not gonna go through it all, but if someone is in doubt of some of the first century writings, there's a lot. There's quite a lot of first century writings on these things, and that's just on the account of holy baptism. It's just historical documents where it talks about baptism. There's also accounts of the martyrs, right? First century accounts of martyrs. Obviously, you get your writings in the biblical narrative, but you also are going to have writings from other sources, whatnot. Other sources are going to be going into these things and everything. You can see right here, it just talks about John and this one, where it talks about what happened and everything. It talks about individuals that died and whatnot, how they were going through what they were going through. When you start, obviously, the first century sources, there's going to be the biblical narrative, and then you're going to also have other writings like Clement and different individuals that are writing and whatnot. Going to have different written historical documents of what happened to individuals, right? You can see who they be talking about Philip, talk about what happened with Philip. You get letters from different individuals, historical documents that talk about basically martyrs that were being killed, right? Different ones. Remember James? Remember what did we just find out with James? Remember James was killed in 62, but this one just put 63. But we know in 62 was the time with James. You can see other writings where it talks about James, what happened with him, right? different writings that's going to basically contest the same thing that he was stoned, right? We have seen that with Josephus' writing as well. These are just external writings, right? That talks about James was stoned early on, right? These are saints that they were talking about. But obviously, first century. Now you got obviously second century. More details. This is not going to be from the book. This is going from the Gospels. It's going to be from other historical quotes and everything. You're going to see first century historical quotes that's going to be talking about these individuals and everything. It's a really interesting read through, right? AD 75, you can see different ones, whatnot, of individuals writing of different things. A lot. It's a lot on it. I'm going to go over here. So I just put this here just to show there is historical documents of the real saints and what they really did, what was the way, all the way from the first century to the 15th century, right? So, it's a long time of recording of history. It's very, very important. So these are the two that I recommend on this little Martyr's Merit. If you never, well, not Martyr's Merit, on this reading, if you never heard his writings, hear this one, Misquotes and Gnostic, this one right here, and 15 on let me make sure the right book, right? On 9 on book 3, right? On book 3, I'm gonna close this. On book 3, where you can see right here, book 3. If you go to number 9, it'll talk about Paul and some information on Paul. Remember, this is a first century writer. He talks about Paul and he talks about other individuals. And remember, he's rebuking Gnosticism. That's very important. He's rebuking Gnosticism that's going on at that time.
Against Heresies by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon.
So the book is
to those the Marcionites who allege that Paul alone knew the truth, and that to
yeah. This was interesting. Let me just let you hear a little bit of this, what he says right here, just to like this point right here.
Was the only apostle who had knowledge of the truth. With regard Against Heresies by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. Book 3, Chapter 13. Refutation of the opinion that Paul was the only apostle who had knowledge of the truth. With regard to those the Marcionites who allege that Paul alone knew the truth, and that to him the mystery was manifested by revelation, let Paul himself convict them when he says that one and the same God wrought in Peter for the apostolate of the circumcision, and in himself for the Gentiles. Peter, therefore, was an apostle of that very God, who also was Paul's God, and him whom Peter preached as God among those of the circumcision, and likewise the Son of God, Paul declared also among the Gentiles. For our Lord never came to save Paul alone, nor is God so limited in means that he should have but one apostle, who knew the dispensation of his Son. And again, when Paul says, "How beautiful are the feet of those bringing glad tidings of good things and preaching the gospel of peace," he shows clearly that it was not merely one, but there were many who used to preach the truth. And again, in the epistle to the Corinthians, when he had recounted all those who had seen God after the resurrection, he says in continuation, "But whether it were I or they, so we preach, and so you believed."
So just for clarity, what was Paul doing? Paul was basically addressing that there were other disciples. Paul wasn't the only one to write the book or even the letters. He had other people writing. Other people was writing and moving around and spreading the gospel. That's very important. So very, very important, right? That's why even John, right, this disciple of John, he writes that basically this, right? Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And everyone that loves him that begat, right, loves him also that is begotten of him, right? Basically it's saying whoever loves Christ, loves the Father, and anyone who loves the Father loves the Son, right? Long story short is what he's illustrating, right? Beautiful message that he writes on here from John 5:1, 1 John 5:1 to 5:13. Now let me show you something. Now let's get to the last piece of history I want to show you here, right? I want to show you one more thing here, as I think is very important, right? Let me play something here. Now to bring it home. to understand what was going on, the connection with certain things and whatnot.
Not by all, but certainly by some Christians, including influential leaders. Clement of Alexandria, a Christian theologian and head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, was one. Lactantius, Christian advisor to Constantine the Great, was another. Many Gnostic Christians also embraced it. Reasonable conclusion is that they got it from Plato. Plato was especially popular. Here's the thing. We have no ancient Egyptian texts from before Plato's time that expressed such ideas. There thus is no evidence that such ideas existed in Egypt. We do have Plato's writings that express those ideas, and we know that Plato was extremely influential.
All right, so I'm going to let this play, and we're going to talk about some
In fact,
information
in a
here.
period when Plato was especially popular, repeating ideas found in Plato by Greeks who knew Greek philosophy better than any other philosophy, the most reasonable conclusion is that they got it from Plato.
Hermetic philosophy also influenced Christianity through the Alexandrian church fathers, St. Clement and St. Origen, who synthesized pagan and Christian religious doctrines. It is due to such theologians that the Hermetic concept of the Word is found in the opening verse of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word.
Clement and Origen lived centuries after the Gospel of John was written. But the fact is, the concept of the Logos, the Word, is found in Philo's writings. He was a Jewish Platonic philosopher who lived in the 1st century CE in Alexandria, where the Hermetic writings were produced. Scholars have shown that it was he who influenced Hermetic writing, not the other way around.
Hermes Thoth was known to the ancients as the scribe of the gods and master of the Word.
Remember that? We talked about that, how it's very important to know who's Gnostics and very important to note that there are other individuals who have basically this belief that we were talking about right here, this little thing, right? Very important to know that other people influence this thing. This thing is actually a combination of multiple different things, right? It's actually, in fact, originally when it starts to merge together, they start merging, but the idea, the final concept of it was fully at its final stage about the 1st century. So it was a confusion that was thanks to the Gnostics. It became a branch from the Gnostics. That's very important. That's why we'll see it talked about as becoming basically a cult of God. A cult of the god Hermes was essentially a form of pagan Gnosticism. That's very important. Let's continue. So when they say Christian, note a lot of people, when they think of Gnostics, they just say Christian, and that causes confusion. Rather, a Gnostic isn't a Christian, they're a Gnostic. Though they're called Christians, they are not Christians. They may believe in Christ, but they don't believe in the exact way to Christ. They themselves have other doctrines, and it's even proven that historians already proved that they themselves also get doctrine from Jewish individuals and other individuals. So that's what you just saw there, that they was getting doctrine from other individuals. That's very important. That's why they got their final stage of that mix. But let's continue.
In the Hermetica, God utters a word which calms the chaotic waters of creation. The word is even called the Son of God. In Christianity, Jesus Christ, who is also called the Son of God, is identified as an embodiment of the power of the word.
This is a chicken or egg question. Which came first? Can he demonstrate that the Hermetic teaching of the Logos as the Son of God was earlier than the Christian? I don't think he can.
St. Augustine, the influential 4th century theologian who was familiar with the works of Hermes, writes, "That which is called the Christian religion existed amongst the ancients, and never did not exist. From the beginning of the human race until Christ came in the flesh, at which time the true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christianity."
The argument he seems to be making here, assuming I am catching his drift, is that when Augustine of Hippo says that the Christian religion began at the beginning of the human race, he's referring to the teachings of Hermes. This can't be so, because Augustine explicitly calls Hermes Trismegistus a liar and without any Holy Spirit. Alternatively, Gandhi may be arguing that Since Augustine says that the Christian religion began at the beginning of the human race, then that means that the Hermetica must have two, because it influenced Christianity. This reasoning makes two unfounded assumptions. One, that Augustine's view of the origins of religion are correct, and two, that the Hermetica could not have influenced the Christian religion after the religion started. It had to come before. I don't mean to strawman him, so if I am misinterpreting his argument, let me know in the comments.
The influence of the Hermetica on early Christianity is beyond doubt. In 1945, works of Hermes were discovered amongst scriptures belonging to Gnostic Christians of the first centuries. And according to a note on one of the texts, early Christian communities possessed many copies of the works of Hermes.
Remember, you heard that word, Gnostic Christians or Christian Gnostics, right? Gnostic Christians. Remember, Gnosticism, right? Gnosticism is a branch of paganism. That's very important. That Gnosticism is not the original Christianity, nor is it walking in the exact way of the saints. But other saints who were real saints in the time of the first century were rebuking the Gnostics. It's very important. And we talked about that before. We talked in detail of the Gnostics, right? First century, second century individuals. It continues on as well when we'll talk about some things with that. But very important to understand Gnosticism, right? Gnostic Christians, right? They have a little bit of Christ. If you don't know their teachings, good. Because what their teachings is basically a combination of combining Christ with all types of idolatry, right? Especially the one of Hermes, the Great Three, whatnot, right? Times three, whatnot. That individual, that combination was being rebuked early on by the original saints. That's very important. But let's continue. So remember, Gnostic Christianity, that's something different than original Christianity, the original way.
Just a few yards from the place where these scriptures were found are ancient Egyptian tombs, and these were inhabited by early Christian hermits, such as Saint Pachomius, the founder of the first Christian monastic community. The walls of these tombs are covered in hieroglyphs ascribed to the great god Thoth. They describe a spiritual rebirth into knowledge of God, and in such places early Christians pored over the Hermetica. Under its powerful influence, they composed their own philosophy of a saving gnosis, a direct knowledge of God, but this time bestowed by their Messiah, Jesus.
Yes, indeed. In a collection of Coptic texts that were discovered near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, there were 5 Hermetic texts, which were written in the Sahidic dialect, 2 of which were previously unknown. These books were from the 4th century CE and belonged to a group of Gnostic Christians. Clearly, this group integrated Hermeticism into their version of Christianity. I'm not sure why Gandhi is bringing this up.
All the evidence suggests that Casaubon was wrong to simply dismiss the Hermetica as some cobbled-together mixture of different philosophies. The Hermetica was undoubtedly written by Alexandrian scholars for a Greek-speaking readership, but it contains a powerful echo of the ancient wisdom on which it was based. It offers us one of the best windows available to gaze into Egypt's remotest past. With its help, we can understand the mystical vision that inspired the awesome pyramids.
Since the only evidence Gandhi gave us that the contents of the Hermetica came from Egypt's remotest past is the pyramid text, but he didn't show us any of the doctrines that the Hermetica took from the pyramid text, it's kind of hard to judge. If any Hermeticists out there can provide such evidence, or any evidence at all, that the contents of the Hermetica are from Egypt's early days, we would be very grateful. As always, you can leave comments below the video. But most of the arguments in Gandhi's intro boils down to, you can't disprove it, therefore it's right. That's not a strong support to build a belief upon. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I've got more videos like this, so please browse through the catalog and watch another that appeals to you.
All right, so that's what we got today. So now let's bring it all home. What did we just learn in summary? So let's summarize what we just learned today. Go down. What was it that we learned today? What we learned today was that linguistics is important. When you think about who is Jesus, you got to follow the trail of linguistics, right? Don't take no one's strange idea that Jesus means hell Zeus, because that's linguistic retardation. We know that Jesus actually comes from the name Yeshua. That's very important. That's what we were talking about, the name Yeshua. We even seen the earliest writings from the earliest Aramaic books, right? Getting some of those writings from those things to get understanding, right? That's very important. And also we know that early on the name Isu or Isus, right, with an I, that I never sounded like a J. That's very important. Also that ESUS, right? In English, it may sound the same, right? When you pronounce certain ways like that, it may sound the same, but it does not sound the same in Latin or in Greek. It's very important. If you say Isus in the language, the ancient language of the Greeks, of Cunon Greek, or how you say it, that word doesn't come up to hail Zeus. Anyone who says that is a linguistic, is disabled in linguistics, doesn't understand linguistics, need to look a little more into linguistics for that. Very important. That note is right here. This note will be in the description. I'm gonna go down a little bit. Also, what's important is we already talked about how the lands of Israel, by the historical documents, if you take any historical document, you can find Israel over here. Don't listen to anyone who has a historical document without an actual connection of wars and anything like that and try to say Israel is over here. Be careful, because Israel is right here. And we can find that with multiple pieces of information. All right. Close this. All right. So over here, make sure what's this? 70 weeks prophecy is important to know, right? We already talked about how the Messiah is not connected to all the idols that were previous. Messiah is a Messiah, the understanding of how Messiah is, and the understanding of true Christianity, not the Gnosticism, not the mixing in with anything else, not the ones that fall away, but the true way of Christianity. Is important to understand that they have nothing to do with idols. We get a bunch of saints that rebuke it too as well. There's a belief, there's a religion, that's a combination of Hermes and Thoth. That belief and religion is a combination that was being rebuked at that time of the early saints, right? It's not a mystery. It is not nothing new. It's something that was happening long time ago. The Christian thinker, or the Christians that followed that, were Gnostics. Like this individual, Clement of Alexandria, was a Gnostic. That's very important. He was a Gnostic. There's certain individuals that were Gnostics and had secret writings and stuff like that. They call themselves Christians, but at the end of the day, their work contests of them. Their work contests of them. So you can see we already went into that, right? Talked about a little bit of that. We went into the writings of Hermes, known as Hermetrika, something like that, and basically just talked about they were a cult and they were influenced by all types of things, by Egyptian religion, Jews, and Christians, right? And obviously the Greek philosophy. They was actually the morph form. And we know that their final form was not known until later 2nd century. So 2nd century is when it was finally known. That's when you get your peak of your Gnosticism. The Gnostics, right? In fact, that belief, when they say it's connected to Christians, that's the Gnostic Christians. The cult of the god Hermes was essentially a form of pagan Gnosticism. It was already being rebuked in the 1st century. If you see any of the writings of the 1st century writers, especially rebuking all heresies, that's going to be talking majorly about the Gnosticism that was going on, that was merging in that time, right? Got to be careful of the Gnosticism. The Gnosticism is different than what is actually something that's allowed. So Irenaeus was one of the individuals that was basically rebuking a lot of Gnosticism. We'll talk about others also that rebuke a lot of that Gnosticism. The real believers who were still there. Remember, this was a disciple of the disciple of John. So remember that. He's a disciple of the disciple of John, and he shows that he was by his works. So these are other individuals. We talked about Tertullian. We'll talk about Origen, and we'll talk about Justin Martyr soon. We'll talk about those individuals. So now you're seeing Irenaeus. We talked about Tertullian. We'll talk about Origen, Justin Martyr, and some others later on. So with that, you've seen it. We just showed a little information. With that, be careful of those that try to do basically idol merging, right? Christ alone himself in the perfection of truth. He himself shows himself to be different than anything else. Very important. And he is seen in history, in the historicity of all things. I'm gonna leave it off on one more thing real fast. I'm gonna read something real fast. One more thing. Just go up here and just read something over here. Go back up a little bit. All right, I'm gonna read this little thing that we was talking about. I'm gonna read this thing down a little bit. Remember, we was talking about that conclusion on the historicity of Christ and all the multiple pieces of writing, like Eliezer that writes about him. That remember that same Eliezer got convinced of Christianity, got converted to Christianity, right? Very important. Also, Tacticus writes about the Christians and all that stuff, and other writers write about Christos, right? We already seen that and everything and whatnot. So very important. We get other writers that talk about Christ. These are a lot of other writers, individuals that speak about Christ and everything. Different names of individuals that speak about Christ. So just to get a final understanding on this thing, right? This is a very interesting book. But just to get a good understanding on these things, I'm just going to read this. This is what I believe is very important. The historicity of Jesus as a heretic teacher of Jewish law is established beyond a doubt by the testimony of his disciple, John. This person right here, just going to copy, right? This is an individual that not a lot of people actually know about, right? But this individual actually writes some things. Actually, what is it? John? Jacob? I think I got that twisted real fast, right? Jacob, right? Not John, Jacob, right? This individual that you see here, right? He's gonna be. You can get a little bit on his writings. You can look into his writings and what he talks about. He's a Jew. This individual was an unknown man, but he converted to Judaism. But he's known in the Talmud, right? In fact, he's as early as 43 AD. You can see his writings as early as 43 AD. Not a lot of people actually know about it, but you can see it itself. The follower of Jesus in the Talmud, the 5 disciples of Jesus, right? You can see a little bit of writings on him. If you ever want to see it, we go deep into his writings himself. But there's multiple pieces of information. I'll, in fact, copy this and I'll put it over here, right? Just to get a little understanding that this is a real source right here. But this is going to be from JPass, right? You have JPass to see it. But there's also other places you can see this said. So it's very early on, 42, 43 AD, right? This is going to be later on, this individual that writes about the historicity of this individual, right? So very important to get a little understanding on this individual. So that's some writings that if you've never seen it, you should definitely see it. So this individual, right? He basically writes, let me close this and this one, right? He writes about the Messiah, right? A man unknown, close that, a man unknown to Christian sources, right? Transmitted through the rabbis, right? Through the rabbis, Eliezer, right? This individual, Eliezer and Akab in AD 100. You see what's going on there? Both of the latter witnesses being decidedly hostile, right? Or obviously they dedicate themselves to being hostile, right? To Christianity, right? They decide to be completely hostile to Christianity, right? The execution of one Christos, when we talked about Eliezer, when we talked about that name and what happened and how he got converted to Christianity, right? We talked about that when we went into the information of Eliezer. We talked about how he got into that, and he also wrote about the Yeshua, the converter, who converted people, right? But he talks about the execution of one Christus, right, by the Roman governor Pilate. Remember Pontius Pilate under Tiberius Caesar, right, after his father, right, Augustus, whatnot. So execution of one Christus by the Roman governor Pilate under Tiberius as a criminal and founder of a band of conspirators hostile to the whole human race is established thanks to the testimony of Tacticus. So that lets us know that Christians and Christ, and obviously the people who were spreading the gospel, was there in the first century. By the first century, doing exactly what the gospel says was going on. It's not no hidden mystery. It was not no secret plot. But Paul, Peter, because this book even talks about Peter, it talks about Paul. But just to get the understanding here, Messiah is not an idol. Messiah himself is as real as Paul. Paul and Peter and all the saints that were there in that time are contested in historical accounts. So with that, family, I want you to be blessed. I want you to be beloved. And amen.